task force for being here at our third of our 6 task force meetings. And again, our goal is to review the findings of the technical work group and make policy recommendations to the county board by the 1st of April. I want to thank Supervisor Chavla for making audio recordings of our past meetings. Those are found online, and I think they've been very helpful. I've gotten calls of appreciation of that. And a reminder that we are complying with our open meetings law and want to provide the public with as much information and complete information about the county's meetings. So all meetings are noticed. All of our information is posted online. And we strongly encourage public input and have created a special email address. I just want to remind people what that is. It's yaharaflooding@countyofdane.com. So all emails that come to that address will be posted. Let's do introductions, and if we could introduce both the technical work group and the task force. I'm Pam Porter, chair of the Dane County Lakes and Watershed Commission, and I'm a researcher at the University of Wisconsin's Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems.
I'm Michelle Ritt, co-chair of the task force, and I chair the Environment, Ag, Natural Resources Committee for Dane County. I'm a county board supervisor. I represent the lovely north side of Madison.
I'm John Reimer with Dane County Land and Water Resource Department. I was part of the technical work group.
Eric Veith, I live on Lake Kaganza. I'm also a civil engineer with Strand Associates in Madison.
Chinu from UW-Madison. I was part of the technical group.
Good evening, everyone. Shelley Alness with the Department of Natural Resources. I was also on the technical advisory team.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Travis Schrader, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the Waterway and Wetlands Supervisor for the Dane County area.
Hi, I'm Rob Phillips, City of Madison City Engineer.
David Pfeiffer, Chair of the Town of Pleasant Springs, and I live on the Yahara River south of Lake Kaganza.
Chuck Erickson, Dane County Board Supervisor, District 13, also a member of the Dane County Lakes and Watershed Commission and chair of the Dane County Sustainable Subcommittee. And my district includes the zoo, borders Lake Wingra, borders Monona Bay, and I still have 200 sandbags around my house.
Hi, I'm Yogesh Chavla. I'm the County Board Supervisor in District 6. That's the near east side of Madison, the Willie Street neighborhood and the Shank-Atwood neighborhood. We have a lot of Lake Monona, Lake Shore in our district, and we got a lot of the after effects of the flooding. I'm also the secretary of both the Land Conservation Committee and the Environment, Ag, and Natural Resources Committee, ENER. Thank you.
I'm Dave Ripp, County Supervisor from the northwest corner. Got been part of Lake Mendota, Wisconsin River, up to the Sauk and Columbia County line.
Tup Wells, retired, lived near the Hilldale Shopping Center.
Stephanie Brower, citizen, resident of the town of Barry. I'm on the County Park Commission and the City of Middleton Conservancy Lands Commission.
Thank you. I noticed one small correction in the minutes, I think, unless the staff can tell me, but there's a small correction that the vote on, it should be 12-0, I think, as opposed to 11-0. It's in 2 locations of the minutes. So if anyone would like to move that correction to the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Supervisor Erickson, second. Tupwells made the motion. Any other corrections?
I would like to propose an amendment to the minutes on the comments that Joe Chapusky made. I think we should make a brief addition to that because his comments really focused with great energy and vigor that Lake Mendota should be drawn down 1 foot. So I would respectfully suggest that after the first sentence, we add a sentence, proposed that Lake Mendota be drawn down 1 foot.
Second.
Any opposition to those 2 changes? If not, could I have a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
So moved.
I didn't catch the second.
Brower Chavla.
Thank you, Brower Chevla. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? So moved. Thank you. Now we're going to have a presentation tonight. Last week we talked about 3 of the options, the scenarios, and tonight we're going to talk with the technical work group and led by John Reimer, the other 4 options that are being presented. So, John, no further ado, let's start with you.
Okay, all right, well, thank you. So I'll present, and the technical work group is here as well to provide other comments. And if you have comments, I may, if okay, facilitate with the other work group
Yes,
members.
sorry, yeah, I wanted to invite the technical work group to please fully join in on the conversation. Feel free to answer questions, work with John on those questions, so it comes from the work group, not solely John. Thank you.
Okay, all right, so what I have for us is, I know a lot of the last meeting, we talked about the adaptation. We started to get a lot into the mitigation scenarios. And on your agenda tonight, if you look at the order, it says recap what we talked about last time, and then talk about the mitigation. I would like to suggest we talk about mitigation first, because that seemed to be what people wanted to talk about. And then at the end, I'll summarize all of them. So that way we can leave tonight with a summary of everything that we understand things to be. So with that, I'm going to start the presentation. And the first slide I have is a pretty basic slide here. And I want to illustrate water levels and flow. And I don't mean to, this is simplistic, and I don't want to, try and make the system seem much simpler than it really is. I was asked to provide a little bit basics of what do we mean by lake levels, water levels, flooding, flow in, flow out. So I just wanted to illustrate a couple concepts so people are aware. So if I use this bathtub, for example, to represent our lakes, we can see that we may have some ideal water level if we're in that bathtub, which I call the lake level orders. What's our ideal water level? And that's shown by those 2 blue, kind of light blue lines, which for our lakes may represent a summer min and a summer max. That's our goal. That's what we'd like to see. That's what the DNR orders are. And oftentimes, when we think about these orders, sometimes, some people would say, well, let's have them higher. Well, that has an impact to wetlands. Another perspective is, let's have them lower. Well, that has an impact to boaters. So lake levels itself is a complex issue, and I'm not qualified to tell you everything about lake levels because there's so many different aspects of lake levels. And what I wanted to focus on today was really the water levels, and how our water levels not necessarily mean we have the right lake levels. Do these mean the same thing? So if you can imagine, we have actually the water in, let me see if I can get this pointer to work here. Yep, so this blue line represents, for example, the water in the bathtub. And if we see this, we have a shower here. There's no handles, no faucet. We can't turn it, just like what happens in the real world. It'll decide to turn on whenever it wants, and we can't control when it rains. So if it does rain, what happens? We get all this flow, this water coming in. And one thing that you see in the bottom here is this little plug here. Imagine that plug here is our dam. And a lot of times the dam, for example, at Babcock or Lake Wabeesa, is continuously wide open. The drain plug is out of the bathtub. And what we see here then is we would want to get flow out of the system. So what happens when it rains or the water comes in? Water levels go up, right? And if it continues to have more rain, if we can't get enough flow out, right, the water level in the bathtub or in our lakes keeps going up. So, and there's a point where water level comes up, and it's driven by the flow. So what I want to show here is if we see the flow in and the flow out, there's a point where if this flow in matches what the flow out is, what happens? The water level stays the same, right? And in order to get the flow out you desire, you need to increase the water level. And I took the 2018 data that we had, just 2018, and I said, well, what's the relationship between water level and flow? And if we look at that, what we see is this line here. Imagine this blue line. This is our kind of regression line of it. These are all the points. So in other words, if we want to get 500 CFS out of Babcock Dam, we need to have about an elevation of 846. So, and if we want to say we want to get 250 CFS, more flow out, because we have more flow in, well, the lake level would be approximately a foot higher, 847. So there's this relationship from a hydraulic perspective that if we want more flow out, we have to have higher water levels. And it's not really what we want to see. We want to see a lot of flow out, but low water levels. But the water levels is driven by the flow. So this relationship is kind of one of the basic hydraulic concepts. We call this, and you can Google search it, a rating curve. So you can look at the water level in the discharge, and you'll see that there's this relationship. Okay? Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Wouldn't you also, we could also have higher flow without having higher water levels if we had a bigger drain, wouldn't we?
Yeah, and I'm not gonna, I haven't illustrated that concept
Okay,
yet.
got it,
This
sorry.
is just.
I was just trying to, okay, got it.
Correct, and I'm
Got
gonna
it.
use this example a little bit when we talk about the different mitigation
Got it.
scenarios and say,
Sorry,
well,
got it.
what if this drain is bigger?
Got it,
Correct.
got it.
So just under the basic
Sorry.
understanding of water levels and flow, right, and if water level goes even higher, right, out of the bathtub, eventually we get damage or flooding that can occur because the water level goes much higher because of all the water coming in and we can't release it. So, and probably people have experienced that in your own bathtub, that there's a point where if the water comes in, you've got a little bit of a drain in your drain plug, you may see a little standing water. And what that is that's trying to equalize, it's raising the water in your bathtub. You got a little bit of a clog, and it raises it just enough so it can get enough pressure to push the water out through the drain. So is there any questions on this one? So overall, what we're saying is we can have the lake levels, we can have them higher or lower, but the flow out of the system is mainly driven by the water levels that we have. So in essence, the flow in, the flow out will determine what we have for a water level. Okay?
Oh, question.
Yes.
Just one question. I know you said it was simplistic, but the one piece that's missing is that in our system, not all the water has to go in the bathtub. If we had more water that was being infiltrated before it gets to the system, that would help too. But not in this diagram.
Yeah, that's correct. You have a hydrology perspective here. But we have, when it rains, for example, 10 inches of rain, first of all, the lake sees 10 inches of water itself. So say it rains 10 inches, and then you're right, you have the watershed. Now, how much can drain in from the watershed and raise it more? Is there more practices on the land that can store it, infiltrate it, and that will help with that? Okay? So what I wanted to get into was then get right into the mitigation. I know this is where a lot of the comments were last time, and now if you have any questions or comments, we're going to talk about them sequentially, the different mitigation options. So the first option was, or alternative that we looked at from a mitigation perspective was, yes?
Can I stop you? I didn't realize you were rolling into the second presentation, right?
Yes, so my plan was to provide the mitigation, and then at the end, recap everything. So we're left
Okay.
at the end with all the scenarios as we leave tonight.
Okay, so I can hold my question then about an adaptation scenario till the end?
Correct?
Okay.
Yes. If that sounds
Yep,
good?
that sounds good.
Okay. Okay, so the first mitigation that's in the report that you'll see is looking at modifications to the bridges. And what essentially we're looking at is, if I can use this simplistic kind of drawing here and say, well, imagine we have this pipe here, this drain pipe, but then we got different couplings or different features within that pipe. And if we make those bigger, those little point features within that drain pipe, what would the lake levels be? So what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, well, here's an example. Here's Exchange Street between, here's Lake Wabeesa, Lake Higanza. There's 14 bridges that we did this on, starting from Lake Monona and going all the way down to Stoughton Dam. And here's a picture of Exchange Street from the bird's eye view here, ortho image. You can see the geometry of the stream, and you can see if I outline the river itself, you see this narrowing part of the river. And if I draw a cross-section of the bridge, you would see the river cross-section like this with the yellow-orange color, and then this would be the road, the deckway, and then here would be some bridge or piles, and all those kind of block flow. Or they may not. So that's what we wanted to look at. So what we're doing here is saying, well, let's re-straighten this out. Of course, there's homes, there's properties, there's things here. We realize that, but what we wanted to do was test how much we could benefit the system by doing this. So right here's an example where we would have the yellow and the red. The river would be just as wide as it was upstream and downstream. So the river itself gets wider if we look at the cross-section. We remove the piers, and we just leave left with the deck. So it would be like a free span type bridge, probably pretty expensive, but what we're doing is just trying to simulate how this improves the system or if it doesn't. Yes.
On Infos Yahara, where do we have monitors along these bridges? I see one at, I think it was Lake Monona Outlet at Bridge Road, but do we actually have like Infos monitors like at all the different bridge areas?
So yeah, good question. Do we have monitors here? So from the USGS gauging station, there's a monitor at Babcock, which is the outlet. In the river itself, what we've done over the years is install pressure transducers to use to calibrate the model. So they're not real time, you don't see them online. But what we have to do is go out and we download the data. You know, because doing real time is expensive, cell modems and batteries, so we've done that to calibrate the model.
Okay. Is that data part of Infos once you download it?
Yeah, it's used in the model to calibrate the model, verify the model results. So and it's, you know, it's not real time, so it's not like I have this right now, because we have to go out in the field and download it.
Okay.
Is that?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to show the result itself next. And what you see from the results here is, as I mentioned last time, this is the water level time series. So the top graph is Monona, Wabeesa, Higanza, and this is water level, starting from January to November of 2018. The blue represents what we experienced in 2018. In the red, which is this color here, bridge modifications, represents what the how this would have fared if we implement this, what the water levels would be. So we can see Monona, Wabeesa, Higanza. Overall, what we see by changing these 14 bridges or modifying them because of their narrow width is very little benefit in lake levels. So we see an inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, depending on the lake we're looking at. So and a lot of this is due to the fact that the river itself may be more limiting than some of these bridges. And if you look, what we're doing here is we're not changing the depth. We're keeping the depth the same, only changing the width. So even if these bridges accumulated sediment, we're not trying to look at that in this case. We're only looking at the width itself. Trying to figure out, is the width important or is the bottom depth important? What's more important? And then we go into the dredging later on. But overall, that's what we're looking at here.
John, in a normal year, would modifying the bridges, when there isn't so much water, would modifying the bridges have a greater impact on I mean, it wouldn't matter as much then, I suppose, because of...
Yeah, I mean, I can ask Chin that from a hydraulic perspective too. You know, if we have lower water levels, would we see a better benefit from the bridges versus a higher water level?
The answer is that I think it's back to probably 10 years ago that we have a Wild Lake too, and we know that bridges maybe play some role as a constriction. At that time, we keep thinking about constriction. So John did this exercise. Basically, they showed that there was no benefit. It doesn't matter how high or how low. During the low flow, you are probably not trying to push more water. We are trying to push more water during the high flow. So to answer your question, there is no benefit to spend a lot of efforts, and even some of it are not realistic. And to increase the flow rate.
Even in a normal flow year?
Even the normal flow is not benefiting too much. And so it was kind of surprising result, but then I keep thinking about how do we illustrate this concept. And I believe that, for example, you have the water, that from here, you want to take this water, go into the other one, what do? You are putting the pipe. You are sucking it, siphon. It's almost of people would do that, siphon a little bit. But if your level itself is so flat, it doesn't matter you are using a big pipe or small pipe. You are still roughly the same. It's not going to cause too much differences. So in other words, a bridge modification that really changes the whole thinking about what we have in the past. Keep thinking about focus on the bridge and widening the bridge. Actually, there's no much difference. I hope this answers your kind of a question that keep going for this direction. In short, we are not getting any benefit out of it, even you spend a lot of efforts.
So John, quick question. I know you've talked before about the Exchange Street Bridge. You said there were 14 bridges. So are your measurements based on sort of an analysis of all of them wrapped up together? All 14 of them? How does?
Yes, so good question. So what we wanted to do was not just pick out one bridge at a time and say, what's the benefit? We said, well, we have all the money in the world here. Let's take them all out. Let's just see the benefit we can get versus trying to say, okay, this bridge we didn't see anything, this bridge we didn't see anything. Let's just take them all out and just see the best benefit we could have. I think you heard from before, Jeremy mentioned, well, we're kind of putting boards on here that let's just remove them all. What's the best benefit we can get? And that's what we tried to do here.
I see. Okay.
So one thing I do have to add, though, is you know, when we talk about these things, these are looking at things independent of each other. So this is just doing bridges. If we decide to dredge, for example, and we put more water on these bridges, like Chin said, we're adding more water, that may be a different answer we get if we start to combine things. And we haven't at this time. It was just looking at these things independently. Okay, so and then in the report, we show this histogram plot, which, as Professor Wu mentioned, we didn't really get much benefit. There's some minor benefit if we look at the score in the corner. As I mentioned before, this score represents the number of feet days above summer maximum. So if we're 4 feet above summer maximum for that day, it would get a score of 4. And if it's 1 foot above summer max, it would get a score of 1. And we add them all the way up, all the way through for the year. So overall, we see some minor benefit, but roughly pretty close to what we were. Okay? Any questions, and we can move on to the next scenario? Okay? Okay, so the next one, as Tuff was alluding to, was, well, what happens at our drain pipe here if we dredge? So, and what we looked at was just dredging in 2 feet in this area in between Monona to Kaganza and 3 feet from the rest of the way. We have yet to really optimize the dredging, but we just said, okay, what's the best we can get by just doing 2 feet and 3 feet through this part.
2 feet between Monona and Wabisa, and then 3 feet between Wabisa and Kaganza.
Correct.
And the dam. Okay.
Correct. So what you see here is the drain of the bathtub I mentioned, and now what we're going to look at is say, well, this drain pipe's going to get bigger. What's going to happen with our water levels? Okay? So here's, for example, a cross-section, typical cross-section that may be in some of these areas. What we did is we assumed a bottom length and a side slope that we could match with the existing side slope, and went between, as I mentioned, 2 to 3 feet from the bottom most part of the channel. So this part may be deeper than it. We took the deepest part of the channel, which we call the thalweg, and at that point decided to go between 2 to 3 feet deeper. So this side of the channel, depending on how your cross-section is, because they're not flat, they're irregular, how much that would take out. Okay?
Supervisor Ripp has a question
Yes.
on
Just
wells.
for kind of a comparison, do you know how many cubic yards we did with the suck them up this year?
Yeah, we did. We did about probably on the order of near 50,000 cubic yards.
Okay, that just kind of gives a reference then for what we need to kick out of here.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
wells.
I think it was clear that a lot of people are interested in dredging. I'm just wondering, as you, and I could be, once again, screwing this up badly, but as you take the cross-section, you're deepening it, but you're not affecting the sloping whatsoever. As you move more water and more water at greater velocity through the channel, do you have to worry about increased erosion of the stream banks, and would that be something we'd have to consider if we actually move ahead on dredging?
Yeah, let me get to a little bit of the
Sorry.
of the flow and maybe even on the velocity that you're thinking of.
Okay.
That's my next one here.
Got it.
So maybe I can
Maybe I'll just be quiet.
No.
I'm trying.
No, so we have to understand, though, when we dredge, there's always complexities of it. The sediment type, is it contaminated? What's in those sediments? In this, for example, we show the historic fish weir, which is between Mobisa, Kaganza. And, this is historic. The Native Americans put that there to trap fish, which, as it's designed, it's a weir. Right now, the rocks are scattered around, so you can't really make signature of what the weir looks like. But in general, these rocks are boulders. You can see one here, quite large boulders, almost as tall as I am in the river. So it's quite significant, these rocks. If dredging, further analysis would need to be looked at is, well, what are we going to do to this area here? Would we be causing impacts to the fish weir? Which when we analyze this, we assumed we're dredging all the way through here. Okay? Okay, so to get to your kind of question, Top, what we looked at was, well, how does the flow change, which is also related to kind of the velocity too. How does the flow change? So I showed this picture before, this graphic, where at a certain water level, we have a discharge. And when we did this scenario, we can replot this same image and see, well, how does our flow and our water levels change? And interestingly, what we're seeing is, if we bring these two together, is you see these two lines. This is the blue represents 2018 that we had, and this kind of pink color represents the dredging case. And one thing that you see is, if we kind of draw a line here and say we need to deliver 750 CFS, just for example, under the blue case, which is the 2018, an elevation of 847.2 would be needed to deliver that amount of flow. Now what happens is, under the new case, because the river's deeper, we can deliver that same amount of flow, but with a lower water level. So a 1 foot lower, for example, water level, over 1 foot, can deliver the same amount of flow. And interestingly, what we found from the results is the flow is about the same. It's just that we're delivering the flow at lower water levels. So, but you could also look at it and say, well, if we're at summer max, the flow would be greater. But in this case, at 2018, we're able to deliver the same amount of flow, but at lower water levels. If that makes, if there's any questions on that. So in other words, there's a lot of thought about, well, we're just going to cause more flooding downstream. We're going to impact further, the Yahara River by sending more water downstream. And actually what we're able to do is send the same amount of water just at a lower water level, because we have all these humps in the river that keep the water level up higher. And now those humps are gone, so the same amount of flow can pass, but just at a lower water level.
So it's
Yes.
the same quantity of water, just that
Just
it's lower? because
Just
of the-
lower because we dredge it out, we dig out the bottom. And if you look at the cross-section we had before, we see this cross-section, and I didn't draw it on here, but if we have a water level here, just imagine your water level in the cross-section is lower because now you have a lower bottom on your river.
Just looking at these amounts of the 50,000, 75,000, what would be your estimate of the amount of time it would take to remove all of that? Months, years?
Well, I mean, it really depends on further analysis. I can let maybe DNR answer the timing, the permitting,
Okay.
kind of the aspects that may go into that, if that'd be okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Are you thinking, Stephanie, just actually the physical?
I was thinking that,
dredge?
yeah, I was just thinking
Oh.
physically, just a guesstimate.
Well, I think it depends, and I can give an estimate, but I think it depends on how far is our dewatering site, how far do they need a pump, how much material are we removing, and how many crews do they have. And when we set up a contract, from a bidding perspective, we can say, well, we need you to complete it within a certain amount. That may mean a contractor is going to bring out 2 crews, 3 crews. It really depends on how we set up that contract to bid. And if we have a shorter time frame, as you would imagine, it's going to cost more because they need to bring out more crews.
Complex answer.
Yeah, I'm
Complex
sorry I can't give
situation.
you
No, that's fine,
an
I
exact
understand.
number.
Miles, and then Chavla.
Two questions. One, in analyzing this scenario, did you, among your assumptions, was it, this is regarding the flow rate, did you assume that the weed cutting and so forth that happened throughout 2018 was exactly the same, so that if we were to combine and do, say, some of those things earlier, there'd maybe be a different result in the flow rate? And then my other question is, the dredging that was done at the railroad bridge in Stoughton, what was that, in June? You saw a significant increase in flow rate when that was done. If there was an increase in flow rate with dredging there, why not in these other locations?
Yeah, so your first question was regarding the aquatic plant management and what we assumed in the modeling. We assumed the aquatic plant managing would be exactly the same. So there's a likelihood, as probably you're alluding to, that is if we have deeper water depths, we can cut areas easier and get closer, because we have enough draft for our boats to cut when we have lower water levels. But then again, we need water depth in that river to help us with that draft. So we're lowering the water level, but that's also lowering in that cross-section. So it may not be true that we are, in fact, getting deeper water depth in that cross-section, because what we want to do is lower the water level. And roughly we may be staying about the same in that cross-section. So I didn't plot that to say exactly, but overall the water level is lowering, and then also in the cross-section it would be lowering.
I think I could help here. So, John, if you just drew a straight line at like 845 or 846 across, you would note that the flow would increase once you hit the pink. So it's not quite double, but I think that's what you'd see is after the dredging like it happened at the railroad bridge. Even
we
if you're
would
at the
see
same elevation, you're gonna see that.
Okay, so we would see an increase in flow rate.
At the,
If it was dredged.
if we have the same elevation. But what we see is, I'm going to go to the next slide, is actually the water levels all go down. So in 2018, so, and that's what we want. We want the lake levels to go down. So, no, if you.
Let me go back to answer Supervisor Well question. You are asking about, can you go back to the previous profile slide? You are asking about the slope stability, geotechnical slope stability question. Excellent question. When we look at this, we do not think about too much on the slope stability. They need further analysis. We are cutting this one to begin with. Okay, so they need any kind of dredge. We need to go further about what is the right angles. Second, as you can see, the result. Interestingly, the velocity stay the same. It's not a discharge. Is the erosion is caused by the velocity, not caused by the discharge. Okay, so to answer that, your question is that both still, doesn't matter, even the velocity stay the same, we still need to go back to check the slope stability to make sure that everything channel is stable.
Okay, Chava had a question?
Yeah, since we have the historical fish weir up here, I was wondering, first off, can we do this dredging and preserve this fish weir? And also, who do we partner with to discuss the historical and cultural protections that we might want to do in dredging? It looked like when we had the YLAG 2 process that we brought in some staff archaeologists and some folks from the Wisconsin Historical Society. Do we also have some tribal partners who we can consult with and talk about maybe some of these dredging plans and doing it in such a way where we can achieve our technical goals, but also be sensitive to the cultural and historical significance of some of these sites here as well?
Yeah, I think I'll let Shelley answer that. Actually, Shelley is the expert with working with the tribal agents.
Okay.
Sure, yeah, hi, good question. The key here would be, just like you stated, Supervisor, where we are ensuring that we're being respectful of the historical presence of this, of these artifacts. And so step one would need to be to work both with the tribe and with the Historical Society. So for this scenario, the assumption was made that we would dredge in this area. But of course, we can't in real life make that assumption. So as the applications come into our agency, one of the things that I would be doing is reaching out to the tribe and starting that discussion with them to see how they feel about it. You know, if they don't want anything done with it, then we work with that. If they are willing to work with us on maybe making some adjustments, we work with that. But it's all coordinated through the tribe and through the Historical Society. So that's a very good question. I appreciate you asking that.
I have another question that's probably a DNR question. What does the permitting process look like? Let's just, jump ahead. Let's say, okay, we're all about dredging. We want to dredge. We're telling you today.
Sure.
What does that process look like?
So I'm going to let Travis answer that, but just know that we're going to kind of talk in generalities because we don't know specifically what the project is yet. So we're going to do our best to give you guys, Travis is going to lay out kind of all the different processes for the regulations involved, knowing that depending on what gets done along the way, it could trigger something else. So we'll do our best to give a timeline and an overview of the permitting for you.
So I really appreciate the question. And I'm going to talk really big picture here, so I apologize, like Shelley said, if I don't get down to the details for you. But generally what we're looking at is before anybody even comes in with an application, we ask that sediment testing be done, which is found under NR 347, and that's something Dane County is well aware of. But basically, before an application comes in a door, we want to know what kind of contaminants are in it, if any, so we could help on the process of what needs to happen with the sediment once dredging is proposed. Sediment management is a huge part of dredging. From there, once we get that figured out, we've got a pretty good idea between all of the parties what disposal options are on the table. The biggest question mark out there is the application that comes into the department. If it has everything we need and I'm going to talk quick process and with a complete application with everything that's in it. The process, the department gets 30 days upon receipt of an application to determine if the application is complete. So you have 30 days right there. It's pretty common to say, hey, there's some concerns here, a field visit might be needed. If an application was received today and a field visit was needed, obviously the weather outside isn't going to make that feasible. The department takes its role very seriously. One of the things I do want to bring up with dredging, and I know this is probably the most unpopular point that anybody's going to make today, so I will take that opportunity. But dredging's a really great idea for a number of reasons, but it has some negative aspects to it as well. And I just wanted to point to the cross-section that John drew and just point out one thing, that a lot of what this task force and a lot of folks are very interested in is flooding and high water levels. But when the department evaluates a dredging proposal, we're also evaluating the opposite scenario when we have a lack of water or low water levels. So while this, sorry, John.
That's okay. Go forward. Yeah. There you go.
All right. So while we see here that it would come down to here, if we were at low water in the middle of the summer, would this have a negative aspect? If we didn't get a good snowfall in the winter and didn't get that ground or the recharge on the system, which I truly appreciate the flooding, but on the other spectrum, if there was no water in the system, how does this affect navigation between the system in the river? How does this affect fish spawning? How does this affect water levels on the side with wetlands that have turtles and snakes and animals buried in the mud? So there's the opposite portion of just removing the muck, and it's balancing the ecosystem versus the flooding issue. So the department has a number of different biologists that have taken a look at some of these things. We have water quality biologists that would take a look at, okay, when you remove this, how does that affect water quality? How does that affect, if you dredge, how are we going to minimize sediment impact? How are we going to minimize anything that gets put into the water? When you have, what are the fish impacts from dredging? With just over 225,000 cubic yards of material being removed, there's probably going to be an impact to the fish populations and the fish habitat in these stretches. We would put forth comments on that. We'd work with the applicant to make sure it's as least environmentally damaging as possible. From there, it goes out to a public notice period. That public notice period runs 30 days. So it has to be published as a Class 1 notice in a local newspaper, and any member of the public that would like more information is allowed by statute the chance to have a hearing. It's not required, but given the large, complex nature of a project like this, that's something we would also probably just hold right of way. The other thing that fits in there is on large projects, there's what's known as the environmental impact statement. Due to statute, we are bound to determine if that is a needed document. Now, a lot of folks in the room might not have ever heard environmental impact statement. These are large documents that do take a good amount of time to pull together. That they're an all-encompassing document that look at all of the impacts in the watershed, in the water, on the land, where it's getting disposed. It's a very voluminous document that does take a good amount of time to pull together. Again, it's hard for me to give you a time stamp on how long something like that would take, because generally we're not doing these. These are large controversial projects that spur this type of statement to be prepared. So right now we're at 30 days, but we haven't touched all the information gathering. Obviously, John and the technical team have put a ton of time and work into this, and it's taken months to pull this together, and an application could take a good amount of time. But by the way the process works, 30 days of public notice, and then once that public notice is finished, the department has 30 days to make a decision. That's short and sweet, and it sounds very quick, 30, 60, 90, which is what we generally tell the folks in the public. You have to remember
Can you
there's
summarize that again? So is it
30
90?
days of initial review.
Yep.
30 days of public notice and 30 days to summarize everything and make a decision on that application.
If there's no EIS.
If there's no EIS, if there's no public informational hearing, and if there's no contested case hearing.
And is it your professional guesstimate that there would or wouldn't be an EIS required for this? What would you say, knowing what you know?
I think that's all gonna depend on what options the county comes up with, what's all part of it. Are there other pieces that are gonna get pulled in? Kind of all depends on how big it's gonna get and if it gets controversial or if it gets many different permits pulled into it. It's very hard to tell. But basically, you're looking at 90 days if everything goes right and we've got a full and complete application. That's really the key to this. And a lot of that happens at the pre-application meeting that we set up with our team. We make sure that we've got all the right people in the room to answer any questions and to respond to any potential applications they might oversee. Like Travis brought up with the sediment. If there were a contamination issue, we would make sure that our waste staff are there to help with guiding you through what their regulation process is and their permitting.
Yep.
John, when you analyze the rivers and the river bottoms for their depth, I'm assuming you had to pick a spot to do that, or did you average across the entire width of the river when determining what the depths are?
So your question was on the dredge depth? How
Well,
do
no,
we-
like in the report, you've got the map of the river bottom
Oh, yeah.
from, say, Kaganza to Stoughton.
Yeah.
And it's got the varying heights to try and determine where there may be obstructions. Is that an average of depth over the whole width of the river, or is that navigating down one path with a depth finder? How did that information get developed?
Okay, yes, so the information that got developed in there is through surveys, cross-section surveys. And then what is shown in that drawing, the profile, is the thalweg, or this deepest part of the channel. And you see that undulating going up and down throughout the cross-section. So what we would need to do is probably say, well, we see that up and down, how can we optimize it? And maybe in some areas where it's down, we don't need to dredge as much. In some areas, we need to dredge more.
Right.
So,
And width-wise, you'd be proposing to dredge from the full width of the river? Is the thing, as far as what that model was assuming, was that it was full width?
no, actually, it was assuming just a 50-foot wide bottom. But we would need to look at that a little bit further to see, as Professor Wu mentioned, what's the stability of that? Is that still going to be intact? Do we need to go bank to bank?
Right.
And that's still a question we need to figure out yet.
And this didn't involve any actual sampling of the bottom to see what kind of sediments you're dealing with, or did it?
We have some sediment samples to show what type of bottom. Mostly, at least in the very high velocity areas, it's mostly dominated by sand.
That's what I was going to say, is that the comparison to the suck the muck analogy isn't really very good here. My experience in that river is that it's a sandy bottom, that there is very little sediment in the river. The sediment is where there's no current, but where the water is moving, that's a sandy bottom. You can stand on it, you're not sinking in. It's a very different thing than sucking the muck.
Yeah, that's what we found in the rivers where it's the river width is narrow, or we have accumulation. It's on the sand type. Yeah, it's not the silty clay type material that muck may be.
Thank you.
So probably I can provide a little bit information here, is that for years, almost every year, 1 year, 2 years, we always go out, have students just surveying, have fun, collect a lot of data. So what you said exactly correct. So in the river channel, usually it's probably very sandy. On the side channel, is a lot of very clayish stuff. As you can see, probably we were not able to do too much, but most of the time we found still quite at least a foot or two. Even we put a lot of wells, that groundwater well, when we pounding, we usually found probably 2 or 3 feet before we reach the bottom. So to answer your question, we did have quite a lot of data, but it's not exactly the same year. We are just for years just put all the data together, and this is the best data we can get at this point.
Okay, Porter, then Wells.
Yeah, I guess my question is, the sand, Dr. Rubens, is it natural or is it conveyed through stormwater or both? I mean, Madison just sanded all the streets in the city of Madison. I assume that sand ends up in the river and ends up being kind of a contaminant.
I am not qualified to answer that question because that one requires tracing the sediment, where are they coming from? So this is a very tough question. But I believe the city of Madison has done a great job to make sure sediment will not go into the water as much as they could. I'm endorse that based upon what I can see.
I wasn't casting blame on you, Rob.
Actually,
by
not
the way.
blaming. While I'm joking, I also believe that quite a lot of sediment coming from a river. On the side, we are trying to do the best. The best management practice have done for many years, has done quite a good job. We can see, but we have not touched this stream or this river for years. So quite a lot of deposit sediments there.
Okay, Wells, then Chavla, then Brower.
In terms of dredging and looking ahead to implementation and the regulatory process we'd have to go through, would there be any advantage as opposed to saying we're going to do a whole stretch with 50,000 cubic yards or whatever, to identifying stretches and trouble spots within them and developing an application based on that as opposed to dealing with an entire segment? Any bureaucratic or regulatory or practical advantage to that approach?
I'll take this one, John. I appreciate the question. A lot of times, applications do come in with large scales, and we just want to assume a 3-to-1 slope and a V-channel profile, and we'll just assume we're going to do everything. What it makes really difficult is that there are certain portions of the river that are extremely valuable to protect, and that doesn't help us identify what the main target areas you really need to get the best bang for your buck are, and that we might spend time haggling over a 100-foot stretch that you never intended to dredge, but that we feel is extremely important for an endangered mussel that's federally protected. We might spend time haggling over fish spawning areas on the side when you had no intention of dredging that area.
I would never do that.
I totally agree with you. I bet you wouldn't. But what I like to advise people is come forward with what gives you the best bang for your buck and what solves your problem for the longest stretch possible. Because the more time we spend on, do you really need this, and does this help, and does that help, and we can't have it there, but we can have it here, that takes time. And that stretches out the process quite a bit. And now, if you came in with just a straight channel on 50,000 cubic yards, it's absolutely guaranteed that we're going to need field visits. We're going to need multiple season site visits to understand how much effect you're going to have removing that material is going to have on the adjacent portions. Is it going to have impacts on terrestrial animals, nesting, plants, that type of thing? So there's a lot of evaluation when you look at these large-scale projects, and going somewhere with 50,000 cubic yards and planning that disposal and that sediment management is harder than if 5,000 cubic yards of targeted dredging, you might be able to go with one disposal location and get that process taken care of a little quicker.
Got it. Thank you.
Chavla?
So another question about the permitting process. Is it a one-time dredging permit, or is it something we could do in perpetuity? I guess, how long is the validity period for that actual dredging? Because I'm assuming the sediment will come back and we might have to go through that process again at some point.
That's a great question. Thank you. So the question was timelines or dredging permit length. So per statute, we can issue a dredging permit for up to 10 years. We can also issue one extension of 10 years to that permit. Going through the individual permit process does get you some advantages. All the heavy lifting that this group would do in an application, and especially probably a county, would give you benefits in the future. If there were problem areas that needed to be redredged in the future, the timelines are much quicker when the project has already happened, and we can say, we dredged 7,000 cubic yards from X to Y, there were no impacts. So now with the next process, you don't need a lot of these in-depth studies, you don't need a lot of that site visits, you don't need to to really justify that there will be no impacts on that community. So the timeline speeds up from 90 days to 30 days or less.
Brower, then Phillips.
John, I wondered, did you, when you were looking at all this, did you look at fish spawning areas and wetland areas? Was that a consideration at all?
When we did this, we just looked at dredging the bottom, the bottom of that cross-section. We aren't looking in the overbank, the wetland areas, just the bottom
Just the
itself.
bottom. Thanks.
Yes.
Okay, Phillips?
Thank you, and I appreciate the folks from the DNR being here today to help us understand this. At what point in the process is the decision as to the type of environmental action that be required made? And can that action change over time if something new is discovered? I assume it could.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, there would be some flexibility built into all of it. And there's no hardcore rules. We're allowed some flexibility within the code and how it's written. But it all starts once the application comes into Travis's shop and we get the scope of the project and what's all involved. And as we were saying earlier, one thing might lead to another thing, where you're researching if the sediment is clean for a certain stretch, we're good to go. We've got everything lined up with disposal and such, but then maybe the next section we discover something that we didn't know was there, that kind of thing. So there has to be flexibility built into the system.
I assume the initial determination is made early, though, correct?
Yeah, are you speaking specifically to the WIPA process and the EIS?
Yes.
Yeah, I would think that would be made relatively early.
And is there anything between a full EIS and some other type of action?
There is not anymore.
Okay.
I should assure everyone, Travis did a really good job laying out. We've got a whole team of experts from all different areas that would be reviewing this application and helping his team to make sure that we're covering the fish spawning, the time of year. We've had some general discussions with fisheries on what type of species are out there that are of greatest concern, where the spawning's occurring, that type of thing. So Travis's team works with all of those experts to really minimize any environmental impacts and yet help the city and the county reach your goals, understanding that that's really what you're after here is to try and increase that flow, to reduce the flooding, and we're here to support and do what we can while protecting the environment.
Are we all good for questions for now? All right.
Okay, we had other questions, and I never showed you guys the results with the water levels. So overall, the results, and you can see it in the report, I'll just briefly say this so we can move on to the next ones, which are, we see, maybe a 10-inch, 12-inch lowering depending on the lake. So overall, the water levels lower, allow us to pass that flow at lower water levels. So,
John,
yes.
John, this is a great graph to just throw out there my unpopular point of the night. And if you look between February and March on Lake Higanza, you can see that the water comes down almost a foot. And when you get fish moving up streams, and that's the time pike are starting to move upstream and they're looking to spawn, that's your walleye spawn. I mean, you're getting right into that time. So in different years, that effect might be negative. So just something I just want to point that out.
Yeah. So one thing we did here with the modeling was we recognized the water level orders, which are March 1st, we bring it up. And that's why you see this increase right at March during that time period. Okay? And we can see the next plot, which is in your report as well, this histogram, and you can see we are changing the score about in half. So when we see overall, before, for example, Lake Monona, we had maybe 10 days where we're 42 inches above the summer max. Now we have 0 days, now with maybe 10 days where we're 30 inches. So we see we bring ourselves down and save 12 inches by this scenario on Lake Monona. Okay, so overall, what we're seeing by these histogram plots, if you're not familiar with them, is how can we shift these higher ends over and bring more days within this summer min, summer max. That's kind of the goal when you look at these with your eyes, is can we take these big days, which we have, or these big numbers, which is the flooding, shift those over and have more days within the range. Okay? Okay, so on to the next scenario. All right. Okay, so the next one is called flow reroute and pumping. And try to make a graphic here with the bathtub here, which is taking that water and pump it out. Okay? So I'm not sure how many people do this with their own bathtub, but I guess if you had a water problem, that's probably what you'd do, maybe. Okay, so what we're looking at is if we do this scenario, what's our water level going to be in our lakes or in our bathtub? And when we first started this, and a lot of this didn't get in the report, part of it is we didn't have enough time, but also we wanted it just to relay what we did complete. And we had discussion of looking at how could we reroute the flow by pumping. And some of that would have been out of the system completely to, for example, bad fish. Or we also discussed pump it down to the next lake because we knew some of the complexities with dredging in here. Is it contaminated? Kind of the stuff you heard from Travis. Okay, sorry. And then the fish weir we talked about. How can we, is that going to be an issue with doing it, dredging in that area? We were trying to think of a different alternative for some of that complexity we may encounter. So, and that's what this option is looking at. And I'll show a couple maps that we thought of. One was what we call pumping down, which didn't get it into the report because what we knew was if we pump it down from Lake Wabeesa, we looked at following the Highway 51 corridor. We have a road here, but then out of Lake Higanza, we still got to get it out. So would we pump it out again? Would we dredge it out again? And we thought, well, we put this one aside right now and just said, well, let's try and look at if we just pump it out of the system, which is what I'm going to show on the right-hand side. This is Lake Wabeesa. And we see here, I'll give a little bit more information. MMSD, if you're not familiar, the sewage plant discharges their effluent right now to Badfish Creek. They diverted their water, their effluent around from dumping in the lakes to Badfish Creek. So when we looked at this scenario, and I apologize for what's in the report that this didn't make it in there, was what are the different routes we would go? And we would need to look at the feasibility of these. For example, one route is we would go from Lake Wabeesa, Jordan Drive area here, and we could just follow the roads all the way. We have road right-of-ways. Does this make the most sense? And when I draw this on the map, wherever I draw it, there's going to be, somebody's going to say, well, that goes through my property, that goes through here. It's a tough thing to draw everything, and we know there's going to be probably some conflicts with that, but we haven't done the feasibility to know what is the route we want to go. But I want to just show you, could be multiple routes. One is from Lake Wabeesa to Badfish Creek through the road right-of-ways, maybe even underneath the roads, depending on the shape of the road. Could we tear up the road and rebuild it if we needed to. Another option maybe is going down another road. This would be then all easements going through other property if we can't get through this road. And I haven't gone out to the site to look what is the most feasible with all the snow. I haven't seen this for myself. Another route 3 is instead of on Jordan Drive, we come off Tower Drive. And I think what did get put in the report was option 4 here, which, this goes through wetlands, and these are very valuable wetlands. We want to consider protecting these. So I know there's been a lot of, suggestions to update the report. I've heard from Supervisor Chawla, can we have the equation in the report for that? I've heard from Tupf about, should we really say safely manage, kind of subjective. So I've been taking these notes, and I would suggest in the report that we revise this to show that there's not just one route. And I see people kind of agreeing with that. Yes, and we haven't done the feasibility to know which route. So I cannot say which route we would go, because at any route, yes.
So how long would the feasibility take? How long would the feasibility take?
I would suggest the feasibility would go more than just the route. It would be, what's the cost of it? What's the pumping size of it? And this would be probably not with Dane County. Dane County, we don't have necessarily the expertise. We haven't built any of these. So it'd be great to have other experts to tell us and give us an idea of what this would be.
Okay, so is this a long-term option then? Longer term, meaning 3 years, 5 years? Or is it?
A feasibility study, can be done depending on what the time frame we set for. For example, let's just say we have a consultant do it. Depending on the time frame we put in there, do we want a year for them to do that work? Maybe that's appropriate.
Okay.
This is from my perspective, though. I totally agree with Supervisor Eric that definitely anything pumping, we should think about long term. It's not a short term, and provide us the opportunity to think about it, go through all the feasibility study, all the route, all the suggestion. I strongly believe that's how the process goes through, is that all of this, the task force, providing all the comments, and I'm already taking a note, John taking a note. We're going to revise all of those and make sure that we respond to the questions as well as the public comments. So to answer your question shortly, that definitely is a long-term period.
So, just one point, I just want to, it's seeming like all the mitigation scenarios that we're talking about, none of them are probably going to give us any impact this year or this season. It's looking like maybe some of this stuff, if we get the dredging, for example, we were presented with those timelines, it looks like maybe the earliest some of this could be implemented would be the summer of 2020. But this approaching spring and summer and fall, it looks like our options are going to be pretty much limited to the tools we have now.
Yeah, go ahead, Shelley.
Sure, yeah. It's hard for us to define, given we don't know the scope, but to help you with that, we are willing to do what we can to help address this, and if it means trying to expedite things with the help and the support of the county and providing all of the information, we can look into doing what we can with that. As Travis mentioned, there's hardcore things that we can't expedite. There's required public comment period and that type of thing. But the DNR is willing to do what we can to help you with it. I wouldn't want to say that we could or could not hit something by this year because there's just too many ifs right now. But from a, being on the task force and looking cumulatively at all the options, it does seem like dredging would be one of the more short-term attainable ones for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Supervisor Miles, did you have a question?
Yeah, comment and question. Thank you for presenting these other routes. I can say that there are some folks I've heard from that were very concerned about seeing this one route suggested to the wetlands. And they're certainly sensitive and valuable. I would also comment that on option 3, the town of Dunn made a significant investment of both money and just people power in restoring wetland in their heritage park there in that area where that's displayed. So just point of information there. I noticed on the comments that we received, there was somebody that mentioned something in regards to regulations around floodplain and that those should come into play in consideration of these. And I don't know if we're obligated to do that, but it seemed like there's some important considerations to take into account when we look at that. Like, what are we doing downstream as far as are we putting increasing flood risk to folks downstream and so forth. One question I have in regards to if there were piping, would one of the concerns we'd have to look at is whether or not having water flow through a large pipe out of the lake create disturbance in sediment and releasing phosphorus.
Yeah, you're getting to my next slide, so that's great. So one thing when we look at this, and this site really kind of makes a nice ideal site over, actually not in this wetland area, on this other side. If you see here, there's a kind of pond area here. And a lot of times, and Supervisor Rip is familiar, at Fish Lake and Crystal Lake. So pumping isn't new to us. Actually, those two lakes have pumps on them. They're enclosed water bodies, and how do they get their water out? Only through, well, I shouldn't say only. You know, water can go through the ground or evaporate, but they have pumps on both of those lakes. And what do they design on those lakes? Usually you have a pipeline to the lake, then you have some sort of equalizing pool inside somewhere else, so that way when you pull the water out of another area, you're not directly pulling the bottom sediments. You would have screens on your pipe that come in to block passage of fish or anything that would be coming in. And then when you remove the water, you're removing it from a stable environment. Here's just a picture showing, you know, kind of a concrete wall. I'm not saying we would do it here, but create a stable environment so you're not pulling up the sediments. Because most likely what would be required from DNR under a WPDS permit is TSS requirements, which is sediment, and phosphorus requirements. That would be a requirement of the permit. So we would, you know, first of all, we wouldn't want to deliver a lot of nutrients downstream, but also for permit compliance, we would want to make sure we're meeting those requirements.
And John, I just want to throw this out there. TSS is total suspended solids, so that's the amount of turbidity in the water or the sediment that's in the water. So I know at the department we're fairly acronym heavy, so if I say any acronyms that people don't know, please stop me and just say, what is that? So.
Yep, that's great. So yeah, there would be part of the feasibility study if that would be happening. I think we wrote it in there that a lot more thinking needs to be done on this about what's the pumping intake, where's the route, how big are the pumps, what's the cost, and all that factors into what the cost is.
And I'm just going to answer the question since it's not been asked yet, but I know it will be. What's the permitting of these type of aspects, and what type of permitting does the department look at? So from the department, you know, John mentioned a WPDS permit, which is a wastewater permit, and looking at some of those nutrients and the total suspended solids or the turbidity of the water. There's also a Chapter 30 or a public waterway permit that would happen if you had a pump below the ordinary high water mark in a lake, and the outfall that would go into the creek downstream. The other thing that often escapes a feasibility study like this is wetland impact. You know, we've kind of briefed over wetland impact real quick. There's two different kinds of wetland impact permits. There's general permits and there's individual permits. Right now, an individual permit for an impact over 10,000 square feet of fill, does require wetland mitigation. So I only bring that up because if you are going to impact more than 10,000 square feet, that adds to the cost very fast. So wetland mitigation is when you impact it in one place, you have to replace it at another. So there's a check that does need to get cut for some of that impact. And wetland mitigation credits start right around $60,000 to $80,000 per acre, and the ratio is generally 1.2, 1.5 to 1 acre of credit. So if you are impacting 1 acre of credit, you have to replace it with 1.2 to 1.5 of mitigation credits. So hopefully that was clear enough for everybody, but if there's an acre of impact, it's probably going to cost you in that realm of $100,000 extra just for replacement of wetlands.
Is it safe to say that DNR would look disfavorably at the option through the wetlands? They would look more favorably at options 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you for that question, and that brings about a great point that I missed. So the question is, would the department look unfavorably upon the alignments through the wetlands? And the wetland permit process is driven by what's known as an alternatives analysis. And it's simply, can you do your project without impacting wetlands? Is there an opportunity to construct this that's not financially unfeasible or structurally or another reason? Is there an alternative that's less damaging to the wetland that is practical? And that's what is done in the application is the department works with you to identify those options. Are they out there? If option number 4 would impact 1 acre of high quality wetland, but option number 1 up there would have, let's say, 1,000 square feet of wetland impact and it'd be a lower quality wetland, then we would ask you to do number 1.
So, yes.
Yes. Yes is my answer.
Okay.
Sorry. That was a
Thanks.
little lengthy. I agree.
Okay.
So.
Okay, Wells?
I may be wrong, but there may be another complicating factor here, and that is you are discharging to Badfish Creek, so there are issues, the quality of the effluent that's discharged to Badfish Creek, and I think in particular, even if the sewage district's adaptive management program is completely successful, I think there are still elevated phosphorus levels in Badfish Creek that MMSD would have to deal with. Just the point making that if our effluent was rich in phosphorus, that might be another challenge in terms of its discharge to Badfish Creek.
Yeah, all of that would need to be looked at and considered. As John said, we didn't have the time to get that far into it, but very good points. And cumulatively, all of that would need to be analyzed, working with all the partners involved.
We'll speak out a little bit. These option pumping ideas, we did it probably a while ago too. We talk about a little bit. Indeed, internally with the Dane County, we talk a little bit more about it. Although I'm at university, at that time I did reach out for this type of project. I personally believe that it go beyond the state level. So I did reach out to a Rock Island district, Army Corps Engineering, particularly that they can cost share up to 50% of the cost if you are in a flooding concern. So I thought of this basically a great idea, but obviously that we will need to put it on order means what? Everything put it on order that they will need to stake it there. 10 years ago, we put it there, probably we are now in the piling in the middle now. So obviously that if we are not doing it, or if we are doing it, I still believe that this go beyond what we should tackle it within the state. We should be kind of proactive working with the Army Corps. Hopefully there is some kind of leveraging with the cost, because it's not an easy job. A lot of different things, not only in the state requirement, as far as I'm aware of it, anything kind of dredging more than certain amount of a number, seems like I need to talk to Army Corps. You probably know more than what I was told by someone. I'm going to shut up.
And because the Yahara Lakes, or Yahara River is a Section 10 waterway, Army Corps of Engineers would be involved in any project here. So
that's a good point.
Chavla? So in WILAG 2, it looked like there was 3 recommendations that involved pumping, and they all got 22 points. What happened after WILAG 2 to some of the ideas for pumping and for dredging? It looks like some of the ideas we're talking about now were also talked about in WILAG 2. Was there some work product that came out of WILAG 2? Because it seems like those had pretty high just votes in terms of all the different recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, what you see there, this is probably the next version from that, using 20, that was 2008 case we looked at. Now we kind of similarly did the same thing, but now we did even a little bit more details with some of the adaptation ones. We didn't do some of them before, but now we're using the 2018 to show under the 2018 year, what would the results be. So 2008 was the largest flooding that we had at the time, and that's the case we did.
John, I think Supervisor's getting at, if there was a lot of support for pumping in 2000, in the WILAG 2, why wasn't it pursued?
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm getting to.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, I can't answer why. There wasn't money put in the budget. There wasn't anything allocated to take it to the next step. So all it was just a report that you saw, and there was no funding to bring it to the next step.
That was way before my time.
Yep.
2008 was way before my time on the county stuff. So.
Supervisor Ripp?
Yeah, just a couple more comments and questions, because I deal with pumping on Crystal. And we just got done with renewing our permit and extending our pipe. And we've tried different filters, And you can remove an awful lot of suspended solids and everything with the right filters. And now when we renewed our permit and we've extended a little further, according to the DNR, we're actually diluting what the sewage district is putting in. We're making the creek better by adding our water than when, from below the sewer plant now it's cleaner.
I just want to follow up on the Y Lake 2 report. And my recollection was that the group at that point was trying to move things forward by consensus, and that there wasn't consensus on a path forward at that time, other than because Infos was just getting off the ground and so forth, that let's let that system take hold, start gathering data, and measure how our current management practices are working, get a baseline before making any further decisions. So it's those two things, I think.
If I could just add, from the technical committee's work that we did, even though the feasibility hasn't been done and it's been talked about, and looking out long-term, flooding's probably not gonna get, we're gonna hope to increase the flow and reduce it and increase our resilience. But there probably will be some continued development within the basin, some continued impervious surfaces. So it seems that if it's feasible, now might be a really good time to take that next step with looking into the flow reroute and the pumping, because it would be a tool that the county could use. As I understand it, the pumping wasn't going to happen continuously. It's just when it's needed to help get it out of the system. And I'm glad, Supervisor Ripp, you brought that point up about increasing it when you're adding essentially a fresher supply to a potentially impaired waterway. That could be one of the benefits. We also would have to look at the temperature and the flow and what species could be impacted. But it does seem like this would be a good time to take that next step and look into the feasibility of possibly doing something like this, knowing that if some dredging is done in aquatic plant management, it's not the silver bullet that's going to fix everything.
Okay, so now here are the results. So we see water levels are pretty much lower. And one thing that you notice when you look at this is one lake in particular you see really nicely is maintained more often within the permit range. And you see that lake is Lake Wabeesa. So by providing this, you provide more stable water levels on Lake Wabeesa. We still have a kind of a narrowing between Minot and Wabeesa. We're not doing anything between those lakes. So this is only on Lake Wabeesa. And as we talked about, the wetlands are on Lake Wabeesa on the southern side. This actually helps to kind of stabilize those water levels actually on its supporting lake of Lake Wabeesa. So providing some benefit there from the variability of increasing water levels maybe 4 feet. We don't see that anymore. And in fact, this year on Lake Wabeesa, our lake management staff was going across the lake in boats, getting the bogs that got detached from Lake Wabeesa, and what we did is try putting them back in, and large bogs, and I get a phone call. It's on one side of the lake, send them there the next day, and then the bogs on the other side of the lake. So it was kind of this chasing it back and forth with some of them, but that's the impact we get with the wetlands in this area with this high water levels, and this has a potential to have less of that because of the pumping on Lake Wabeesa. Okay, any questions on the water level?
I got one, John.
Okay.
So I just wanted to be clear that this scenario is just the pumping only, right? From Wabeesa
You are correct,
to
Eric.
Badfish?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think in the report, it's a little bit unclear, and looking at some of the water levels, then there's discussion about a gravity discharge as well, which really wouldn't be possible. Page 37. So if you look at 37 under this mitigation scenario, the following considerations have been identified. So I think there probably is some updates that would need to take place to eliminate some language about flow by gravity. When I read this, I wasn't sure if this was a combination of a gravity pipe from Waubesa to Kaganza and pumping, but it sounds like it's just pumping, which is good to understand.
Yep, so this is just pumping, and if you have any edits or thoughts on the report, I'm open to your thoughts, Eric. So, okay, so then that brings then to what we see, this histogram plot, where we see this, let's just take Lake Waubesa, for example, this great shift from what we had before of the days kind of spread out. Now we see more days within the permit range, which is this 0 number, representing that. And of course, our number here is really small on Lake Waubesa. Lake Monona still can't deliver its water out as efficiently because there's no changes done between Monona and Waubesa. But nonetheless, we see an improvement on Lake Monona. So, and overall then, Lake Waubesa, or Lake Kaganza gets a great benefit because now Lake Kaganza, which is the downstream lake, doesn't see all that water that they normally, or that they would have seen. So, yeah. Okay. Are we ready to go to the next one, which Eric was alluding to is the combination one, and this combination one is recognizing that, in first of all, let me illustrate or say that this combination was just to give us an idea of putting these different ones together. We didn't have time to put all the different combinations together, but we were just trying to illustrate what would happen if we would just do both of them together. And in this case, what we decided was, well, let's dredge between Monona and Waubesa because we saw Monona still was high, but then Waubesa, Kaganza were pretty low. Maybe there's some issues with the fish weir trying to get out of here. So let's do these two scenarios together, which is just dredging between Monona and Waubesa and pumping out of Waubesa to see the outcomes that we would achieve. So in the report, you'll see this by doing this pumping. This is the flow increase that we get in a volume, 95,000 acre feet. And what we tried to do was relate that to the watershed. So the watershed, if we take from Lake Kaganza up, my map is kind of cut off here, but the watershed keeps going up and then going over to the side here. But overall, the watershed has an area of 230,000 acres, and this is a volume. So if we take all this water that we increased and we say we want to spread it all back on the land here evenly, what we're saying is it would spread evenly 5 inches across the whole watershed. So in other words, if we take, and that means wetlands, farm fields, everywhere needs to store 5 inches of water to be equal to this combination scenario. Or in other words, if you can break it down on a 1/4 acre lot with a house, you need to store 34,000 gallons, or your 55-gallon rain barrel needs to be filled 618 times. So to give you a sense of scale about the amount of water we're talking here.
And that's every citizen's rain barrel.
That's every quarter acre lot needs to, in order to be equal to this volume, would have to be filled, you'd have to fill it 618 times.
612 rain barrels.
You have 612?
No, I have 6. So
Oh, okay.
Put the order in.
Okay, so I just wanted to give a sense of scale of what this means for on the watershed versus the flow through the system, because it's a tremendous amount of flow that we're talking about here. And to achieve that on the watershed, if we want to see the same results, it would be storing 5 inches everywhere, which this sounds like a lot, but remember, we got 50 inches of rain. So 5 inches is 10%, okay? Normal year is 30 inches of rain. So if you think about the rainfall, maybe it doesn't seem that bad, but when you start putting out the numbers, filling a rain barrel on a quarter-acre lot 618 times, it seems a little bit more. So, okay, so in terms of the results, what we see is Lake Wabeesa has its great achievement within the range because of the pumping there, and now we see also Lake Monona gets that benefit from the dredging. Lake Kaganza here is really alternating in between the summer min and max within that 6 inch, which that's what we'd like to see more often to meet those water level orders. And the final plot shows Monona here has a score now 64. Lake Wabeesa 8. You see pretty much over 200 days within its range. Lake Kaganza, 170, 180 days within its range in the 2018 year. So, so this just shows an example of putting these different combinations together, and there could be a lot of other combinations that we haven't done yet. So, and I just want to acknowledge that we haven't done every single combination yet. Yes.
Thanks, John. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of control we would have? We've been talking a little bit about the low water years. So once the dredging is done, that's done, but how much control would we have over the pumping in a low water year?
Yeah, so in a low water year with the pumping, we just wouldn't turn on the pump.
Okay.
It would just be off, and some of the things that people, or one of the things I'd like to illustrate is the dams that we have at Babcock and La Follette are what we call low head dams. They're really more designed not for flood control dams. That's not what they're designed for. They're designed to store the water, hold the water, for example, in those drought years. Maybe it'll be even more of a drought, it'll be too difficult, but at least those are designed to slow the water down.
I just had a quick question about Badfish Creek, because it looks like it's a fairly short easement there. Where is the water going? It looks like it's going out of the watershed, because Badfish is near the edge of the watershed. Can you talk about that? Where is it going after that?
Yeah, so one unique thing about Badfish is it enters back into the Yahara River. So overall, it's in the Yahara watershed, and when we look at this, it wouldn't be considered what we call an interbasin transfer of water. It's still within the same water. So, for example, we're not pumping water over to the Mississippi River and giving water to another watershed that they normally don't see. This is still within the Yahara.
That's great.
I'm going to add a little bit comments that there are a couple of concerns that which have been raised through our sort of a technical committee when we talk about this one, and also with a few folks. We keep thinking about pumping the water out of the system or pumping, eventually getting out. But we realize that getting our water out of the system somehow impact the downstream. So we are very careful about that. Indeed, even we go beyond that, we're looking at the further downstreams. So ensure the Yahara River in general will never go to 2,000 CFS. But when we check the downstream out of the Stoughton, downstream in Illinois side, they have 20,000 CFS. They have the 1 order of magnitude capacity they can handle versus we only have 2,000. Indeed, they are very happy about probably have more water. So in other words, that we will never put this kind of pain to downstream. No, that's not our intent. We are trying to be very careful about looking at every aspect. If we do so, we are not thinking about go to the downstream. I want to make sure that this concept is very, very clear, or statement very, very clear with all the people that we talk about this one. We are very careful about looking at this aspect.
Okay, so that brings me then to the ending of the mitigation and starting now to summarize, kind of wrap up from the previous meeting, and then I have a shorter summary on the mitigation because we just talked about it. So,
One
yes.
question, John. So, it's back to the aquatic plant management.
Yeah.
So dredging assumed no aquatic plant management? The dredging option just looked at dredging, right?
The dredging option looked at dredging, but it assumed the same aquatic plant management that took place in 18 would take place.
Okay, so would we, the aquatic plant management showed about a 5-inch decrease in lake levels. So would that be added on to the dredging? If we did dredging and did aquatic plant management, would we see, you know, right now, the dredging data was 6, 12, 11, and 7 for the 4 lakes. Would we see an additional 5 inches of drop?
I'm not
Or
sure
we
you
don't
would
know?
see a full 5 inches. I don't know the answer,
Okay.
but I would say that would be another combo of saying, well, we want more aggressive aquatic plant harvesting because now the rivers can support more aquatic plant harvesters. What does that look like? We didn't combo those ones together.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay, Erickson, then Miles, then Phillips.
Thank you. John, so I think part of the answer to my question is on page 44, the table 5 summary of changes to peak water levels from each scenario. So looking under the mitigation at the bottom, A, B, C, and D, so that tells us, I'm gathering, what the drop would be per lake, correct?
Yeah, so that
Okay.
shows from the peak how much the peak would be reduced, the peak water level.
Okay, all right. So and I was asked this by one of my neighbors. So if we had whichever option, say we either just did dredging or we had dredging and pumping, if we had a scenario like August 20th last year, so the question to me was, would we have the same amount of flooding? So what would this give us, depending upon the option?
Are you saying what type of, what storm?
Yeah.
Adding the 15 inches that went to the west or adding other storms?
No, I'm talking about in our watershed, what we received, generally speaking.
In 2018, what we received.
In August of 2018, on August 20th of 2018.
So had we dredged
Correct.
in 2017 and done aquatic plant management,
To some
what would
effect.
we have seen in 2018 if those two tools had been used?
Right, and the real question that I was asked was, would we be sandbagging, if we would have had one or both of these options? How much flooding would there have been?
Yeah, so I think this chart gives you an idea, at least as a starting point, to say, okay, if we dredged and we repeat 2018 again, for
Right.
example, you're on Lake Monona,
Right.
You would have saw a water level decrease of 12 inches from the peak.
And how much did we get in August, on August 20th?
For rainfall?
Yeah, was it
Um,
was up
3 feet
there,
over max or something.
yeah.
For rainfall or water level, how high were we with water level?
Well, rainfall leading to the.
Yeah, rainfall-wise, we were about maybe 4 inches average in the watershed.
Okay.
The part west side got like 11 inches.
And Lake Monona was up to what again?
It would have been just,
It was
at that
over-
point, it was just below 100-year water
Okay.
level prior
Okay.
to that August rain.
So ideally, would it be safe to say that we'd see less sandbagging, less flooding, like, in Brittingham Park and the Near East Side?
If 2018 is exactly repeated and
Yeah, right.
we would have had these implemented, that's what the modeling shows, is that it would have been lower.
Right, okay. I'd asked that, I was asked that, so I,
Good question.
yeah.
Miles.
John, you said that the assumptions were that the aquatic plant management was assumed the same as 2018. Is that according to the aquatic plant management plan, or did it include the emergency orders from in the spring or early summer?
Yeah, so specifically, the way you run the model for aquatic plants is they cause friction in the water, reduce the slow of flow. We assumed that the friction would be exactly the same, or in other words, we would cut exactly the same locations, the same time, everything would be the same with its friction or resistance to flow.
So it includes the management that was done.
It includes the management that was done in 2018. I know Pam Pam was asking about, well, what if we would have done more harvesting and kind of combo those, because now we have deeper water, we can maybe support more aquatic plant harvesters, and if we reduce the amount of friction, then what would the water levels be? And we didn't run that combination scenario.
So that relates to another question I had in regards to harvesting and the emergency orders. Is it was one of the questions posted since our last meeting on the website was whether or not what was done under emergency orders could be just incorporated as part of our regular management.
Yeah, so his question was on the emergency order. So what we have for our rivers is permits. They're every 5 years we have a permit. We've never historically cut south of Lake Higanza. This year was the first year we did, and we asked the DNR for emergency permit to cut that part. And we're planning that, or we would like to see that would continue for probably maybe another emergency year. The thing with the permits is we need to do a lot of work with those permits. We need to do point intercept surveys, which is looking at what are the plants there, what are the species, documenting everything that's there, so we know in a 5-year period maybe what those impacts are. So.
Well, we do that as part of our every 5 years when we renew the.
Correct. Every 5 years we do that. Yeah, but not in that section. We haven't done that.
Right. And so my question is, can we incorporate that the next?
That's what our hope is. Correct. Exactly.
Okay, Phillips first, then V.
Well, first, an observation. It's impressive at how much pumping does alone without the dredging. It's almost a little counterintuitive sometimes, but and then the combination of the two. How realistic is it that you can move the 400 CFS? I mean, is that likely? In the end, is that a likely number, or how do you feel about that?
So his question is how likely it is. Originally in 2008, that was kind of what we found was a good number, and we applied it here. And we looked. If you look on page 37 of the report, one thing we looked at was the flow in Badfish Creek. And one thing that's interesting about it is we see a peak go way up to 2,000. So it gave us a feeling about the capacity that Badfish would have. Also, one thing you notice is you see these spikes. They're very short-lived. It's a very flashy stream. So it gave us some hope that to say, well, when we see rainfall, when we see a flashiness in Badfish, the pump wouldn't be running. And you'd shut it off after. You wouldn't run it. You would have some sort of system to identify. We wouldn't want flooding in Badfish to shut the pump off. But since it's so flashy, we could turn it on again after that would subside.
Thanks, John.
Okay, V. Then Wells.
Yeah, just to, I guess, kind of answer Rob's question. You would be able to move 400 CFS. It's just a matter of what kind of pumps do you have and how much are you willing to spend. So that's really the big question here, and I guess I would echo Shelley's statement that you really can't look at this solution too closely until you do the feasibility study. This project is an engineer's dream. I mean, it's unbelievable, some of the sizes of the pumps that you would see, so I don't know that you could at this point say, the dredging is better than the pumping without even doing the feasibility study for the pumping. So it seems like a logical next step would be to initiate that feasibility study. Now that doesn't leave you a solution in the short term, but I would think that a lot of people are interested in understanding if we had the same rain events in 2019, because we got to wait a little bit to pick our solution, are we going to see the same flooding? And I think everybody's hope is that what we learned last year in terms of some of the emergency orders and the aquatic plant harvesting in Higanza, maybe we could be a little bit better at it this time around and maybe mitigate some of that. I would think that that would be at least something that everybody could, try to shoot for, and not just say it's going to be the same as it was in 2018. So in terms of the short-term solution, I asked this the last time. I'm not sure that there is one, unless you can really get through the dredging solution quickly. But I don't think any of us really know if that's the best solution at this point without going through the feasibility. And the county probably has the resources to implement the dredging. But like John said, they're going to have to hire a consultant to do this feasibility study. And I'll say that it can be done as quickly as somebody wants to pay you to get it done, but it's probably not going to happen in less than 6 months. I mean, you're talking a lot of research, surveying, coordination with the various agencies, so it's a lengthy process.
Eric, feasibility for the pumping?
Yes.
Yes, the pumping takes a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I comment a little bit on, so Rob, 400 CFS equivalent to probably 260 MGD. So we did look at this one internally. They're very carefully. We think about this one. Mississippi River, that they have this kind of World War II pump, quite a few. And last time we asked about it, they can go to 20,000 CFS. So it's not a dream only, but somehow that I totally agree with. We need to do another further study. But how it's going to happen, we talked about in 2008, but we have so many things. We are kind of moving here and there. Someone that need to be willing to kind of take it on. I am personally very happy to keep helping as Wisconsin idea with no other implication. If all the committees really want to keep going, what you need to do is vote for it. We'll keep going from my perspective. But in terms of how it's going to happen, somehow I strongly believe we need Army Corps engineers to come in because they will have the resources to help us to even find a pump. And definitely, or we can go to consultant, which is, if we want to go for that route too, it's okay. You can go to consultant too. But I believe that we need to, all agency, all of you all work together. This is the big project. It's a long term. It's not infeasible. 260 MGD can be done.
Wells?
I guess this is just a comment. I certainly would support a feasibility study on the pumping. I would just as soon us eliminate the let's route this through the Wabisa wetlands. With all due respect, I think that's a non-starter. But I would call the committee's attention to David Marshall's comments on Badfish Creek. I think there may be more issues with that creek, with the flooding that you can get there. They have their own problems with aquatic management. I think it's so flashy because so much of the stream is dominated by MMSD effluent, and they really have to move it if they're experiencing, a bad situation at the plant because of torrential rains. And the other thing I would just remind people of, Badfish itself is a very, very artificial system now. There are miles of that stream where it runs between really high levees. It's been channelized, it's been ditched. So I just think that there are a number of issues that we're going to have to face with the discharge of effluent into Badfish.
Yeah, that's correct. It has been pretty well channelized, even at the outlet where we show it in MMSD. There's like 10 foot wide banks right there. So to provide that capacity for MMSD and for pipes. So
Supervisor Chavla, and then Phillips, and then Rip.
Yeah, so in the long term, it looks like these mitigation scenarios have a lot of promise to them. But it seems like in the short term, when we're thinking about flooding resilience, we might want to look at the adaptation scenarios where we have less water in the lakes, and if Mother Nature permits us this year to have a scenario where we don't have as wet of a spring, we might want to look at creating capacity as much as we can. And I was wondering, since we have the DNR folks here, would they provide the county with the flexibility to go below the targeted seasonal minimums if Mother Nature allows us to, so we could create that capacity, knowing that we've already seen some pretty extreme flooding in our watershed?
Well, unfortunately, our engineer had to leave. John, you might know better how we've worked with you in the past and the flexibility we've afforded the county on those water levels. I'm sorry, I would not be able to respond to that.
We've never had any temporary permit to go below the water level orders. So what that looks like and that is, we haven't asked and done that.
One of the confusions, I think, for the public is that, if I'm right, 90% of the time in the last 5 or 10 years, we've been over. And Supervisor Chavez is asking about, what about the, going under? How does the DNR look at either of those?
So I'm going to answer very briefly, and knowing that I'm not Rob Davis, the expert on this, but I'm just going to give you some quick ideas. And technically, per the order of this dam, there are minimum water levels, as I think we all acknowledge. But to lower that, we have to understand that there were some studies that were done to make that the lowest level that we would want. So there's a whole lot of science that went into that. So basically, you're looking at opening up the water level order is what you're doing, unless you're looking at deferred enforcement from us and just us looking the other way as you manage so many inches below that water level. So the trouble that you get into is if we allow you to operate below for 1 year, then maybe it happens again next year, and then all of a sudden we've come to a new low. And we also have those negative impacts, and we have to take that into effect. If we give you a foot below a water level, now do we have to look at what are the impacts of boats on the Yahara chain? What are the effects of fish spawning? That kind of stuff. That's all information that gets factored into that water level decision.
But haven't you allowed the county to manage lakes higher than the order? I mean, that's
we've
right?
worked with them. Yeah, I mean, when it's
So-
flooding, we can't actually just tell you to pump more water out any faster. We try to minimize the impact downstream as well, knowing that if there's an unlikely event that's above what was reasonable, then we try to work with folks to get back down within that range as effectively as possible. But we try, we're not chasing people on you're a foot high, we need to get you down immediately. We try to work proactively with a lot of folks, but it's not ideal to have these lakes so high. There are other impacts that are above that maximum. So yes, we've worked.
So my next summary slide is talking about this adaptation scenario, if I can maybe go forward on this one, which is to summarize what we talked about on this adaptation scenario. So I want to be clear, though, when we talk about lowering Lake Mendota 1 foot, from a management perspective, there's really 2 alternatives. Are we lowering Lake Mendota 1 foot for flood storage? Right, that's one concept. And in fact, what we did is we looked at lowering it, and this is a new plot. This isn't in your report, but for example, we looked at lowering from the original case, lowering it over a 1 month period, a 1 month drawdown. So in March, we're 1 month lower, which is this yellow line. It's kind of hard to see. It's behind this other red line. In this red line, actually, what we looked at was, well, let's try and draw that out over a 3 month period. We heard some comments from the last meeting about, well, 1 month is too short. Let's try and do it over 3 months. So you can see overall on both cases, right, we have, as I mentioned before, we have 20 feet of water going through this lake. This is lowering it 1 foot. This is affecting 5% of the volume of water. So because we have 20 feet that we need to leave through the system, we can lower it 1 foot, but if we got 20 feet coming in, 20 feet is going to fill back up again unless we discharge it downstream. So that's what you can see here is the water levels continue to rise. and almost meet it. There is a benefit, a 2-inch benefit, so I'm not saying it's not a benefit. There is a 2-inch benefit by doing this over 1 month, you know, in these drawdowns.
A benefit at that peak.
At the peak,
August.
correct. So if we look at the downstream lake under these cases, Lake Monona, what we see when we pulse, you know, over a 1 month drawdown to get a foot, we see a 10-inch rise on Lake Monona. We chose to do it at this time. I know there was a lot of, you know, thoughts about, well, we should extend it out. We decided to do it at this period and show it in the report because this is after the fish spawning. This is trying to get after that period, and it's trying to, and in fact, hindsight's always 20/20, as I mentioned. We didn't have rain during this period. So we can pick exactly when we're going to do this, and that's what we did. And in fact, you can see Lake Monona comes back down again because there's no rain. It's able to deliver that water. But Lake Monona, again, the flow in determines the water, then the flow out determines the water level. So based on that rating curve that we saw, that if we have 500 CFS and we need to get 500 out, it needs to be a certain water level, like your bathtub, to equalize first. So what we can see here is, sure, we can extend out 3 months. We see overall, over a 3-month period, a 4-inch rise on Lake Monona. So that means during ice breakup, during those kind of critical areas where we got potential more runoff event, you would have, if you draw down over a 3-month period, a 4-inch increase in Lake Monona. So by doing that, you got to put the water somewhere. And the downstream lake is going to see it, and because you increase the flow to the next lake, as we know that if we increase the flow in, we also need to increase the flow out. But in order to do that, to increase the flow out, the water level needs to increase to accommodate that extra flow. Okay? So this is under the concept of flood storage. So we're going to lower the lake of Mendota and see it bounce. Instead of 3 feet, we're going to fill it up 4 feet. Okay? That's under the concept of storage. There's another thought from a management perspective, and these aren't the same. When we say lower Lake Mendota 1 foot, what do we really mean? Do we mean for flood storage, or do we mean, well, let me not get to that one right now. So I think I talked about this. I just re-show this again, this discharge curve. This is determined, Lake Monona, in order to get the water out, is determined by how much is, the water level will be determined by how much water can get out of the system. So if we need to get 750 CFS out, the water level should be about 847 on Lake Wabisa. So, and we can see here, I replay this back, that Lake Mendota moved 20 feet of water through its lake in 2018 versus in a 30-inch rainfall year.
Red and green and purple again, John?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have this all on here. The orange or the red here is Lake Mendota.
Mm-hmm.
The green is Lake Wabisa, and the pink is Lake Higanza. So in a normal year, Lake Mendota is moving 12 feet of water through, and we see under a normal year of 12 feet within that range. So we had 8 feet more of water that we're trying to move through the system, and in fact, with that 8 more feet of water, Lake Mendota just saw about a 3.5 foot rise because of the extra flow. So that's one concept under the adaptation of, we can lower Lake Mendota, but from a management perspective, are we talking flood storage? This is under flood storage concept. Another concept is to say, we're going to maintain lower. Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, can you go back and, yeah, thanks. It's not registering to me how we can lower the water 12 inches and still only have a 2-inch difference after the flood event. Can you explain that again?
So what we see here is we lower it 12 inches.
Mm-hmm.
The lakes are continuously filling up during this time period, right? All this water's coming in. In order for Lake Monona to get to release all its water, it's also increasing. So the water keeps coming in, it keeps coming in, it keeps coming in, it can't get it out. We can store what we want on Lake Mendota 1 foot, but in order for Lake Monona to release its water, it needs to get to a certain height.
Yep.
Lake Wabeesa, it needs to get to a certain height so that flow can be released. And we can store 1 foot, but that's 1 foot out of 20 feet that we're storing, so only 5%. And if you look at it, Lake Mendota goes up 3.5 feet. If you look at 5% of 3.5 feet, it's actually about 2 inches.
Got it. Thanks.
It all relates to how flat the system is.
Right, right,
It's gotta move.
right. So it's doing, yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So I mean, echo, we emphasize this though. Last time there was a comment about, quickly release. So then we say, okay, we are not quickly release. We should think about 3 months. Every 1 week, release 1 inch. Every 1 week, release 1 inch extra. So to achieve that status, we can go back to the 6 months, end up with even flatter, can be. But you can see that very quickly when you reach into that flooding periods, you can hold it for 1 foot, but very quickly disappear because you have the total amount, 20 feet of water from Lake Mendota, you want to get rid of it. 1 foot, it helps, but does not help too much. So I hope that it helped, definitely helped. But for the 2018 of the 20 feet, it just go crazy. Just too much water. On the total different side though, a certain year definitely will help. If we are thinking about there's a year that will not be 50 inches, or be probably 20 inches, definitely that year will help, but we do not know about it. So I hope that is clear about definitely will help if we kind of slowly lowering down. On the total different tokens that when you slowly token down, depends on how high you are. So far you are A49, but sometimes you might not be A49. Sometimes you might be very low, or sometimes you might be very high to begin with. So this has still have some kind of thing that need to be tackled with. And so in other words, I would hope that it's addressed to the question that has been raised by how actively or how 1 foot can be low down. Is it how fast? It can be very slow, like 6 months. When John started to do this one in October. But in 2018, couldn't do anything about it. Sorry.
I know that we had like a backlog of questions that we didn't get to, but we're on a roll of other stuff. Rob, did you still have a question?
Actually.
Oh, Dave?
Yeah, it's kind of related to this, I guess. With pumping scenario, we're talking about getting 400 CFS additional. If I remember correctly, we got 350 additional by weed cutting. Around that.
Yeah, around that. Maybe
One concern I have is that we're looking at all these scenarios through the lens of 2018, which was a huge storm event of which we may get more clearly, but it I think obscures one goal of management, which is to reduce the number of years in which we have flooding. It's not just reducing the bad flood, it's the fact that we've had multiple flood years. And I know it takes time, but I would like to see models that instead of taking 2018, take a different precipitation year, see whether with our increase in flow through weed cutting, we're able to improve flow sufficiently to actually have our 3 dams operable again rather than having the bottom 2 wide open all the time. And then does that additional, quote, flood storage in Mendota help to reduce the number of years where we have a significant flood event versus reducing the severity of this one flood event?
Okay, Supervisor Ripp?
Just going back to when we were doing the pumping, dredging, et cetera, does there have to be a certain order? Okay, if we dredge below Monona to get the water out, and we wait another year to get the pipe because it's probably gonna take long to get the pipe figured out. Are we gonna destroy downstream? Do we have to kind of do the pumping, get the pump first and then do the dredging? Or is there gonna be a benefit without flooding out downstream of the dredging first? Because I'm assuming you can get dredging in a lot faster, a year faster.
Yeah, I think I'll answer a little bit to what Travis said, that some of the areas may be limited by the sensitive features that may be there. So the question is, it may be a bottleneck or an area we need to address, but it's sensitive. Do we want to wait 2 or 3 years for that to do the other ones? Or should we do those ones so that way when we get to when the permitting goes through its process, it's ready? So the timing may not be based on the priority. It may be based on what can we get done efficiently and timely.
Right.
And eventually we have a system then that's all put together. But to wait for the critical areas 3 years, for example, I'm just making it up, 3 years from now to start the other ones that may not be a priority, that may prolong the time if we do it that way.
Right. I just want to make sure we're not
Yeah,
flushing Monona
it's a valid
by
question.
taking care of, making Kaganza a whole lot bigger.
Okay, Chavla, then Wells.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like in our current scenario, we have one lever. We have the Mendota Dam, and that's basically, that allows us to kind of push water downstream. And as you were explaining the hydrology of the system, you have to raise the water levels to move the water out. If we're to consider having that second lever, which would be the pump, which is, it's going to help us pull water through the system, would the hydrology of the system change so you wouldn't need to raise the water levels to increase flow? If you're pulling at the bottom, does that affect the hydrology that was assumed as part of this adaptation scenario?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. That when we pump or dredge, we're able to deliver the water at lower water levels. So we don't need as high of a water level to deliver the flow. And I think what you're leading to next is if we do those, then what's the combination of that with lowering Lake Mendota?
Yes, that was my question.
Yeah, and when we get an extreme event, maybe that's a benefit on the extreme event side for storage. But right now, the system is so flat, as Shelley mentioned, so slow that we just can't get the water out efficiently enough that if that's getting out more timely, that you can bring it down, get the storage you need, it fills up, we can get it down again. But right now, you see the graph, and you see it here, it just continuously keeps climbing all the way through the time series. I shouldn't say all the way, but in general, the trend is increasing.
So potentially something that we could consider is if we have these mitigation scenarios, which are essentially giving us a lever at the bottom of the watershed, that might give us some scenarios where we would have the power to do adaptation and we wouldn't see these hydrological effects that we see now.
Yeah, I think that could be another one, but then, I mean, not to say you shouldn't pursue it or whatever, but then there's other complexities, as kind of Shelley mentioned. Well, what's the recreational users? What's the wetland impacts? Beyond probably the scope that I can provide to you about all those different impacts from their team that they can provide. And in fact, if we get down at that level, I wonder, maybe we're happy with that level because it's more stable. Do we even need to consider lowering them? And I don't know that answer from the public, that if we're maintained within the summer min-max more days out of the year, for instance, right now we see this flood event, last one was 2008, and I think David was mentioning this thought that right now we have a flooding maybe one every 10 years if we look at that. Can we start to shift that one every 30 years, every 50 years? And what's our tolerance that we're willing to extend that to?
Wells, and then Buckingham.
I sort of have a meeting issue. We've, John and the experts have gone through a lot of material. There have been some good questions. But as we get to adaptations, we had a really thorough discussion of that last week. We've had a really good, thorough discussion of the mitigation. And I'm conscious that we're after 7, and we have a lot of people here, some of whom I know we have a public hearing next week, but my guess is there are people who want to speak. Would it make sense maybe that we've done enough discussion among ourselves and the experts and hear from the public now? Just a question.
Right, we have a couple more questions.
Okay, that's.
And let's
I can go through this quick.
Let's
too.
revisit that. First of all, Supervisor Buckingham.
I can wait.
Okay, and I have a question and I can wait.
Okay,
Go ahead.
so maybe I just finish quick so everyone here in the room can see all the scenarios. I'll just go through this pretty quickly. If you have some clarifying question, the team here can address that. So, so the other concept was maintain lower. So when we talk about lower Lake Mendota, the management needs to be clear. Are we lowering Lake Mendota 1 foot for flood storage or to continuously maintain lower, which that's this dark line here. As a result, if we continuously maintain lower, try to, and don't see this trending increase in water levels, we see more flashiness with the lower lakes because we're pulsating. We're pushing basically all the water we see Mendota right down to the next lakes. So we need to be clear when we talk about lower Lake Mendota 1 foot. Are we talking lower Lake Mendota 1 foot for flood storage, which is different? We're rising it. Or are we talking because we want to continuously maintain? Because as we heard, right, there's important features with the Cherokee Marsh and different features up here that are also important. So what are we talking about when we mention that? So, and I'm going to go through this quick. We talked about managing Lake Mendota up higher to the 100-year because of this imbalance between Monona was 10 inches above the 100-year, Mendota was 6 inches below, and we increased Lake Mendota. We see a benefit on the lower lakes during that time period. Okay, I'm just going to go through this quick. One was remove all dams, and I think Top made this comment, and I'd like to clarify it in the report, that it's not necessarily the dams are completely gone. It just means that we are not opening and closing them. Everything is wide open. I mean, in reality, it's really only in 2018, it's just Tenney Dam and Stoughton Dam because these two are open out the whole year, Babcock and La Follette. So this is the water levels we see removing it. In fact, we have no buffer from Lake Mendota. Monona sees a little bit higher water levels. Lake Wabeesa does as well, and so does Lake Higanza because the timing of buffering that water to the next lake isn't taken into account. Okay, and I think we talked about this, mitigation. I'm just going to leave you with this. Yahara River dredging, pumping, and then the combined. So, and then these are in the report, the final results at the peak water level. So that's what I have for everyone.
Supervisor Buckingham.
If we were to move forward with one or a combination of these scenarios, how much data would you need to collect under the new circumstances in order to create new models to consider something like what the lake levels should be? Does that make sense? So you wouldn't be able to run the same models if we made changes to the system, right? You would have to have new information to be able to then consider the next phase of what this group might look at.
Yeah, when we run a model, it's always great to have data to calibrate it. So for example, if we dredge, we won't have the data to calibrate it.
Right.
It doesn't mean that we can't put another scenario on top of it, but we have to think about the uncertainty that we're getting once we start to put a lot of different unknowns on top of each other. So it's a model, so we do our best to calibrate it with what we know today. And in fact, if we do dredging, for example, during a certain area, maybe we can collect data and validate the model further. So, but the scenarios could be built on top of each other.
I have a question also probably for our DNR folks. There has been a lot of talk since the flooding happened about potentially opening up the water level order. What would that involve, and how likely would that be to be approved, if you can even say?
I can speak in general. I don't know how much Travis. What I've learned about it is the short answer is it's not a quick fix. It's a very drawn out process, with no guarantees in the end.
What do you mean by drawn out, like? rough-
Time-wise.
Right, but,
We're meeting multiple seasons,
Several
potentially
years.
multiple years.
Yes.
okay.
The reason being, there's a lot of different information that went in originally. There's reasons that lake levels were put at this level, like I said earlier. But if you're going to open it up, we do need to document what those impacts would be and do some research on it. Again, you're talking multiple seasons to look at lowering levels, say a foot, say 6 inches on the system. Are we talking Mendota? Are we talking the entire chain? There's the other portion of it as well that stemmed from the Koshkonong decision, and that's the economics of it. So the department was remanded that case and forced to look at the economics of it. And that's where things got really in depth, so to speak, because lowering level a foot could have an incredible amount of economic impact on certain different stakeholders. And getting that information together and making a responsible decision is something that the Supreme Court has really affirmed with the department, is that we need to be looking at those types of things. So does that help to answer your question?
It weighs everything, the social, the economic, the recreational use, the navigation, the biology, all of that is tied into it, and therefore it becomes a very long process because we have to analyze all those different aspects of adjusting this water level. Like Travis said, it was set where it was for a reason. That doesn't mean that it can't, we can't be petitioned. But there's also, it's a very emotional issue as well. Often there's litigation involved, and that draws it out even more years, so.
In the case of Koshkonong, I think it's 17 years
Yes,
before there is a
going on.
decision.
Yes.
And
So,
yeah.
you're next born.
Yes.
All right. Are there further questions? All right. Seeing none. Thank you, John, and thank you, team. Okay, we're moving on to public comment. Are there folks that are registered?
There are.
Okay, so we'll need the sheets, please.
You could call on Dr. Zedler first, who's old and has sciatica. She's coming to you right now.
Okay. Blue shirt lady? Okay. I realize that we're collecting forms. First up will be Joy Zedler. And we're going to ask people, if possible, to come to the podium up front. On deck will be Donald Sanford and then Eric Kate. And there'll be three, people will have 3 minutes, and Director Hicklin will be your timer.
Hi, I'm Joy Zedler. My PhD is from UW, where I returned in 1998 to be the Aldo Leopold Professor. Is this on? There you go. I live in the town of Dunn, where I offer science-based advice on wetlands. Here, tonight, my advice is to reject Scenario 6 for 3 reasons. First, Scenario 6 did not consider any environmental issues, says my colleague Ken Potter. The recommendation to pipe floodwater out of Lake Wabeesa is not a mandate. It's an engineering analysis of water levels alone, without regard to biodiversity and wetland services that benefit us all. Second, environmental impacts would be too damaging for this wetland of distinction. The newly designated by a society of over 3,000 wetland scientists. In my ebook on Wabeesa wetlands, I described the vulnerable resources in detail. 11 rare wetland types, 27 endangered and threatened species, 73 nesting birds, a major northern pike nursery, carbon stored as peat, and more. A pipe intake anchored to the lake bottom would churn up the peat and nutrients and fuel algal blooms. Sucking floodwater into the lake's toe would pollute the pure groundwaters. This is a groundwater-fed system, pure groundwater. The sucking of the floodwater into the toe would have a huge impact. You could save large fish with screens, but the larvae would die on their 8,000-foot pipe trip to Badfish Creek. Upslope, the MMSD pipeline already created a weed-infested berm through a wedge sedge meadow. It obstructed water flows and formed a row of cottonwood trees that are now poised to blow over and break that aqueduct. Imagine a pipeline needed to transport 7 times that flow. The construction path would be a destruction path. We'd lose pure water, fish, and critical habitat. Unacceptable impacts call for rejecting scenario 6. The third reason is that there are far better alternatives. That's where chapter 7 comes in. Flooding originates in whole watersheds. So let's address the upstream sources using watershed approaches. That's what my book is all about. Flooding, Nick Miller is going to help us find restorable wetlands that can trap floodwaters upstream. Cities can retrofit hardscaping with permeable materials, green swales to infiltrate runoff, green roofs, rain barrels, rain gardens, and tanks to store runoff for use in irrigation. These alternatives reduce flooding at its source and avoid permanent harm to a wetland of distinction. And they're feasible. China is converting its most flood-prone urban areas into sponge cities using holistic, sustainable watershed approaches. So can Dane County. I recommend rejecting scenario 6 now so we can direct our efforts toward watershed solutions. This ebook is free online at the Town of Dunn's website, and I'd be happy to donate 2 more copies if it will help bring us to a watershed approach.
Okay, are there questions for the speaker? Seeing none, thank you. Donald Sanford, followed by Eric Kati.
Well, thank you all. My name is Don Sanford, and I've sort of become an old penny that keeps turning up at this meeting. But I got to tell you, first off, I'm the guy who wrote the book about Lake Mendota on Fourth Lake, the social history. Though I'm not hawking books tonight, but I keep looking back at history. We've been talking about doing something with the lower Yahara. I think last week I talked about an article I'd found from 1954. 1954, that the solution to all of our flooding here was downstream. And this morning, I spent some more time plowing through newspapers, and this got all the way up to 1960. And the county board had money, some studies had been done, there'd been some money appropriated. It got in front of the county board, and it failed. 1960, so that's what, 6 years. And it was regenerated again a year later, and then just sort of died on the vine. Nothing ever happened. We have a lot of academic brain power, horsepower that we witnessed at this meeting, the work that the technical group has done, that John and Professor Wu have done. This is amazing. We couldn't have done this in the 60s. You would have had a room full of guys with slide rules to try and do this much. They've done an incredible job. The county, this group, needs to do something. This is not the time to let this die on the vine. You need to do something, take some action, whatever it is, but the mandate is clear. We can't go through another summer of water downstream up to our necks. We have to do something. And in 1961, the best quote I've found so far is a riparian said, "The county's going to dredge this river over my dead body." Don't cave. This is important work to do. The science is there. We didn't have this kind of science years and years ago. The science is there. We need to take action. This stack of paper represents the articles that I have found just today poking around in newspapers between 1957 and 1967. Lots of conversation, no action. You know, we like to talk about things in Madison and Dane County, but we got to talk. It's time to stop talking and time to pull the trigger and start doing something. Stick a shovel in the ground, stick something in the. Yeah, we got to do something.
Other questions for the speaker? Thank you. Eric Cotte, followed by Charles Dykman.
A lot of comments made last week, I think, and some of the members of the task force have made comments that a few of the adaptation scenarios are outliers. And I tend to disagree with that, and I think having an opinion that they are outliers is a failure to understand what can be deduced from those scenarios. One of the main issues that there seems to be some strength behind is lowering Lake Mendota, whether it be for storage or flood control. And to a degree, that's what John did this year. Early in the season, Lake Mendota was a foot high pretty much all season long. It was a foot high when we got all the rain in August. So we had already used up our 1 foot of flood storage there. An additional foot of flood storage, if we would have lowered the levels early in the season, may have given us some benefit, but where would that water have gone? The water can't leave the system fast enough. Sorry, I didn't put this together too cohesively, but the water needs to leave. So if we're going to manage it a foot lower, we need to be able to get that foot out faster. If we lower the level, John can't hit the current target now, the 6-inch range that is mandated by the DNR. If we get the DNR to allow us to go for a lower target, how are we going to hit that? The system can't discharge the water. Mendota isn't an infinite storage bank. And that brings me to a point I wanted to make. There seems to be some difficulty in understanding kind of what I just talked about. John uses an analogy of a bathtub and a drain and a shower head. I didn't have a whole lot of time to think this analogy through, but what if you looked at it from a financial analogy? Look at Lake Mendota as the bank, whether that's getting a loan or using it as a credit card. The lower lakes would be taking out the loan from Lake Mendota. If we have more storage on Lake Mendota to give them relief, that is them taking out a draw on that loan. At some point, that loan needs to be paid off. And you can increase your credit limit, which would be increasing the amount that is stored on Lake Mendota. But Mendota will go bust at some time. You have to make payments on those loans. And the stream flow is your income stream or your ability to make those payments. If your lifestyle exceeds your income stream, a lot of people will rely on credit. I think that's what we're doing by trying to use Mendota as a storage basin. We are just buying ourselves time that will need to be repaid later. Thank you.
Other questions for the speaker? Thank you. Charles Dykman, followed by Stephen Schooler.
I much appreciate a science-driven analysis of the problem. I think in the past that hasn't happened, as Don Sanford has explained. But I think that is the key to success. I know I can't ask questions, so I'll just have to give my views on things, which aren't necessarily science-based because I'm not that kind of an expert. I've become a fan, after reading a lot of this, of pumping. I suggest the use of Tower Road, Mahoney Road, and Keenan Road, and then section lines which mostly follow lines of ownership. So I think it's easily enough done without getting into the problem of finding land, condemning property, and the like. I think where there's a section line and two people own up to it and it's farmland, I don't think it's that difficult to do that, as it would be if you're going to go right through the middle of somebody's farm field. Lastly, I don't really understand how pumping affects wetlands unless bad fish is itself a wetland, or bad fish can spread out so wide that it does become a wetland. Finally, I don't know how dissolved phosphorus is going to be any different if it, with water, gets pumped into bad fish than it, as today, it goes down and eventually goes to the Rock River. So with these suggestions, I want to thank you very much.
Other questions for the speaker? Thank you. Stephen Schooler, followed by Pete Carnes.
I am Stephen Schooler. I'm a resident on Lake Wabisa, and I'm also affiliated with Joy in terms of the Wabisa wetlands. Couple very, very quick observations. First, I don't think realistically you're going to be able to do the pumping solution or the dredging solution with any significance this summer. So that's number one. Number two is I would suggest at the very least, trying to do a better job of managing Lake Mendota and see what happens. You've got a lot of complicated models here with a lot of assumptions here and there, but why not at least try managing Mendota at a lower level as opposed to the higher level that it was? Also, I'll note there was a lot of talk about, all this stuff with lowering Mendota's level in the DNR. So you should look at the order and the findings of fact from 1979. It totals 3 pages. 3 pages. They talk about recreational use, i.e. the docks on Lake Mendota. They talk about the pike and the walleye, and that's it. Okay? Now, maybe it can be a more extensive thing, but it really was not that extensive a thing. The other thing I'll note is that it states in here that the levels historically for Mendota have ranged from 852 feet to 848 feet. Those are the historical levels, and you're talking about, right now, lowering it to about 848 feet, a historic level. So it isn't, what you're proposing in terms of lowering Mendota isn't way out of the ballpark in terms of what it's always been. So I would simply advocate that you really do make an effort to manage Lake Mendota better this summer and see what happens. That should be the first step. The only other thing I would make, and the only other comment I would add, is that Cal DeWitt did some calculations, and Joy alluded to this. You're actually going to pump 7 times what the MMSD effluent is flowing into Badfish Creek. 7 times the volume. I think that's significant. I think you better take a very, very close look at what that's going to do to Badfish Creek, because it's a lot more water than they've had to deal with. And I would note that the various fluctuations that you show in Badfish Creek, I wonder if that doesn't have to do with the MMSD effluent.
Are there questions for the speaker? Okay, thank you for coming. Okay, Pete Carnes, followed by Ed Minahan.
I believe both the Dane County and the DNR folks are very knowledgeable, and I believe UW-Madison is backstopping this latest committee. However, has the committee used the good offices of the other 4 four-year universities in Wisconsin that have colleges of engineering? Have you used the good offices of the other 2 four-year universities in Wisconsin that have colleges of agriculture? Have you used the good offices of UW Stevens Point that has the largest College of Natural Resources in the country? These people are from outside Dane County, and maybe they would look at stuff with a fresh prism. If the Upper Yahara River has not an August 20th event, but a Lake Dalton event, and the isthmus floods from Blair Street to the river and from lake to lake, not by 2 inches, but or even by 2 feet, but by 2 stories, this is going to make the national news, and it's going to make Madison and Dane County look like fools for kicking this around for decades. I fear that all this grad school / Robert's Rules / bureaucratic solutions will be tied up in meetings, DNR reviews, and litigation for decades. Folks, I think that your grandchildren's grandchildren will be deceased before anything material happens. I have a solution. It's probably nonsense, but let me just preface by saying, as far as interbasin transfers go, we are a democracy, and the elected legislature supersedes the well-intended DNR. My solution is to lay pipe and pumps between Mendota and the Wisconsin River by Mazomanie, lay them underground, and to also lay pipe from Wabisa to the Wisconsin River that can only be activated if a certain legal and scientific threshold is reached. This is not an Enridge pipeline with crude, but if there's a leak, it's H2O only. And make sure that the generators are above the water line so you don't have a TEPCO situation. Could this possibly be the quickest and least costly solution? Thank you.
Other questions for the speaker? Thank you. Ed Minahan, followed by Nick Miller.
I'm Ed Mitigation. This is my 40th year as a chair of the town of Dunn. In those years, we have built 6 detention ponds at our taxpayers' expense. We take our commitment to the lakes very seriously. We have more riparian area than any other municipality in this county, more by miles than the nearest municipality in terms of shoreline. So we take this seriously. The area that you're proposing to pump water from is the cleanest water in the Yahara system. It is down gradient from the release of the very deep springs we have. The surface water is well cleaned by the Wabisa wetlands, so you would be removing that water. And by the way, just to take it off the table, top, you're right, we have standing, nobody is going to put a pipe through the Wabisa wetlands. That will not happen. There's already a pipe that comes from MMSD, and they have a connection to Wabisa with a pipe. It's a nice thing about pipes is they flow both ways. We know they have a connection to Wabisa because when they're stressed, they release thousands of gallons, tens of thousands of gallons of raw sewage into Lake Wabisa. Okay, so those are the kinds of things we have to put up with. There is a chance that you could draw water, if you really want to do this pumping thing, near MMSD, use the existing pipes, or add another pipe. They're going to tell you that they're at capacity. That tells me that that's an opportunity. You should think about it. And just, there's one other thing that you have not addressed, and Ken Potter has been yelling at us for years about this. We're not looking at those closed basins in Columbia County. He has told us that if we think things are bad now, if Columbia County continues to fill those basins, we are going to have very serious issues. So I thank you. Take that under consideration, please.
Other questions for the speaker? Thank you. Nick Miller, followed by Ben Kohlenbreich.
Pardon me. So I'm Nick Miller. I'm with the Nature Conservancy, which is a nonprofit conservation organization that operates around the world and nationally, and here in Wisconsin too. So I'm the director of science with the Wisconsin chapter based here in Madison, as well as a citizen on the Near East side of Madison. So rather than commenting on the alternatives assessed by the technical advisory team, I wanted to get at and focus on another alternative that was just sort of obliquely referred to earlier, and that it's referred to in the report also, but it's not assessed in the report. That is the potential to rely on nature itself to help solve our flooding problems. Wetlands are the powerhouses. They're often called the powerhouses of the natural world, and although they only cover a small portion of Dane County or any portion of the landscape, they provide really important fish and wildlife habitat. They filter and purify waters. They play a number of key services, including regulating flows during and after storm events. And so they help to abate flooding problems. So in the Yahara watershed, over half of our wetlands have been drained and converted to upland. And as the wetlands have been lost, we've lost important services like flood abatement. So this trend can be slowed, stopped, and even reversed to some extent. We can protect the wetlands that remain. This will maintain their flood storage capacity. We can restore wetlands that have been lost, and this will increase storage capacity in the watershed. And unlike other alternatives, which may require impact assessments and require balancing pros and cons, wetland conservation actually has co-benefits. So if you restore a wetland for flood abatement potential, you're also going to get habitat for fish and wildlife. You're going to get cleaner waters entering into our lakes, et cetera. So how do we do that and where? An online statewide decision support tool was recently created in a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy and the Department of Natural Resources. And that's called Wetlands by Design, a watershed approach for Wisconsin. And this tool enables users to find sites to protect and restore that best meet their goals. So I have some maps. I printed them out. I've got extra copies back on my table that show wetlands of the Yahara River's headwater areas above the lakes that could be protected or restored to maximize that flood storage potential. So using this tool, that could be combined with additional modeling and that could complement and add value to or even obviate some of the alternatives on the table. So this is a complementary approach using nature to...
You could wrap up, please.
Yeah, thank you. So that's all I had to say, and I do have additional copies of this if anybody would like to.
Are there questions for the speaker? Okay, thank you. Next is Ben Collenbrake, followed by Paul Zedler. And is there anyone else wishing to speak other than those two that are remaining? Okay, go ahead.
My name is Ben Collenbrake. I'm the Planning and Land Conservation Director for the town of Dunn. I know that a lot of the diagrams that we saw were just kind of models at this point, but I did want to point out that there are a few conservation easements where the pipes would go through that were pointed out today. Legally, those cannot have utilities such as pipes go through those. So before you get too far ahead in the game, I wanted to point that out to the task force. Additionally, those conservation easements have USDA money in them, Dane County money, DNR money, and Town of Dunn money contributed to it as well. So there's a lot of contributions to those easements to consider as well. Additionally, before tonight, I hadn't seen the map that shows that the pipe could go through Dunn Heritage Park, which is a town park that, as Supervisor Miles had alluded to, we've put a lot of money into, along with the federal government and Dane County, to restore as a natural prairie habitat. Additionally, those ponds that you see on the map, those have a dual purpose of being a northern pike spawning habitat and a retention basin for the subdivisions and farms that surround that area. So Additionally, there was high levels of arsenic that was found. We recently dredged those ponds. So before you get too far in that, and to keep that in mind, that there's some things to consider. The total cost that we spent, including grants on that project, was about $100,000 to restore that park. And again, we recently dredged those ponds as well. So a lot of money has been pushed into those projects. I did see one map that showed a pumping line along Highway 51. Maybe the committee didn't know about this, but Highway 51 is being considered for reconstruction in maybe 10 years, depending upon if funding comes through. So maybe there could be some collaboration with the DOT if that's the route that they decide for pumping. I think ultimately pumping is maybe not the route to go, but if it is chosen, I think the 51 option could be available for the route. And that's it.
Other questions for the speaker? Thank you for coming. Are there any other registrants wishing to speak? Okay.
Any announcements from the task force? Okay, so our future meeting is March 5th. There'll be the public hearing. So we want to take as much time as we can to listen to the public.
Time and location.
And the meeting will be here, the public hearing will be here at Fen Oak at 5 p.m. So that's March 5th. Okay? Motion to adjourn? Question? No. Motion to adjourn, Supervisor Erickson. Second, Supervisor Miles. All those in favor? Aye. Thank you.